Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Thorne Merriweather pulled out of Thunder Bay at 10 minutes to 7 in the evening, and the weather forecast on his phone screen showed exactly what he'd been dreading for the past 2 hours. A low-pressure system was sweeping down from James Bay, bringing with it the kind of snow that turned Highway 17 into a white tunnel of uncertainty. Thorne had been driving the Trans-Canada for nearly 12 years, hauling everything from lumber to auto parts across northern Ontario's endless forests, and he knew this stretch better than most. The 500-kilometer run between Thunder Bay and Sault Ste. Marie was lonely even in good weather, just 2 lanes of asphalt threading through black spruce and granite outcrops, with the occasional ghost town or fishing camp breaking up the monotony. But in a blizzard it became something else entirely. It became a test of nerves, equipment, and luck. His dispatcher had offered to push the delivery back a day, but Thorne had declined. He needed the miles, needed the paycheck, and more than that, he needed to prove to himself that he could still handle whatever the highway threw at him. That stubbornness was something his ex-wife had pointed out more than once during their marriage, usually right before she'd slam a door or leave the house for a few hours to cool off. Thorne pushed the thought away and focused on the road ahead, watching the first fat snowflakes appear in his headlight beams like moths drawn to flame. The radio crackled with traffic from other drivers, mostly complaints about visibility and road conditions, mixed with the occasional joke to keep spirits up. Thorne kept his CB volume low, but not off. Out here, that radio was more than just entertainment. It was a lifeline. By 8:30, the snow had thickened into a proper storm. Thorne's wipers beat a steady rhythm across the windshield, fighting to keep the glass clear, but it was a losing battle. Every few seconds, a gust of wind would blast snow across the highway, reducing visibility to almost nothing. He'd dropped his speed to 60 kilometers per hour, sometimes 50 when the gusts hit hardest, and he could feel the weight of his loaded trailer shifting slightly on the ice beneath his wheels. The highways department had been out with salt and sand earlier in the day, but it wasn't enough. Black ice was forming in patches, invisible and deadly, and Thorne knew that one wrong move could send his rig jackknifing across both lanes. He'd seen it happen to other drivers, good drivers, and he had no intention of becoming another cautionary tale on the trucker forums. Around kilometer marker 487, about an hour east of Nipigon, Thorne noticed something odd on his CB. The usual chatter had died down to almost nothing, which wasn't surprising given the conditions. Most drivers were probably too focused on keeping their rigs on the road to bother with small talk. But what replaced the silence was stranger. Every few minutes, a burst of static would erupt from the speaker, followed by what sounded like fragments of a conversation. The words were clipped and distorted, barely intelligible, but Thorne caught enough to recognize the cadence of dispatch communication. Someone calling in coordinates, someone requesting assistance. The problem was, the voice sounded wrong. It had a hollow, echoing quality, like it was bouncing off satellite towers that shouldn't exist out here in the middle of nowhere. Thorne reached for his CB handset and clicked the transmit button twice, the universal signal for "I'm listening, go ahead." Nothing came back except more static. He tried again, this time speaking into the mic. "This is Merriweather eastbound on 17, just past Nipigon. Anyone copying that last transmission?" His voice sounded small and flat inside the cab, swallowed up by the howl of wind outside. For a long moment there was nothing but white noise and the rhythmic thump of his wipers. Then, cutting through the static like a knife, came a voice. It was male, older, with a rasp that suggested decades of cigarettes and diesel fumes. Unit 12, this is dispatch. We're showing your position at marker 462. Confirm your status and advise if you need assistance with road conditions. Thorne's hand tightened on the steering wheel. Marker 462 was behind him, at least 25 kilometers back, somewhere near the turnoff to Red Rock. And he wasn't Unit 12. His rig didn't have a unit number. He was an owner-operator, not part of a fleet. He keyed the mic again, slower this time, choosing his words carefully. Dispatch, this is an independent hauler. Call sign Merriweather. I'm not Unit 12, and I'm well past marker 462. You might have outdated GPS data. Silence stretched out for several seconds, long enough that Thorne started to think he'd imagined the whole thing. Then the voice came back, and this time there was an edge of urgency in it. Unit 12. We're showing you stationary at marker 462. Your transponder indicates you've been there for approximately 40 minutes. If you're experiencing mechanical failure or medical emergency, advise immediately. Thorne's mouth went dry. He glanced at his odometer, then at the kilometer marker post sliding past in the snow. He was definitely moving, definitely well beyond 462. Someone else must be stopped back there, someone using an old or repurposed CB channel. But the dispatcher's voice had specifically said Unit 12, and the way he kept insisting on that position felt less like confusion and more like certainty. The radio crackled again, and this time a different voice broke through. It was younger, tighter, with stress, and unmistakably frightened. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got zero visibility here and my trailer's starting to slide. I need to know if there's a turnaround or pull-off ahead. I can't keep going like this. The voice paused, and Thorne heard the sound of labored breathing over the static. I'm at marker 462, just like you said. But I don't remember stopping. I don't remember... The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched squeal that made Thorne wince and pull the handset away from his ear. When the noise finally died down, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing in on the cab like a physical weight. Thorne's headlights caught something up ahead, a flash of orange and white stripes, the reflective surface of a road sign. He eased off the throttle and let his rig slow down naturally, not trusting his brakes on the ice. As he drew closer, the sign resolved into focus. Highway closure ahead, detour to Kumasi. Below it, a smaller sign with an arrow pointing right, toward what looked like a secondary road branching off into the forest. Thorne had driven this stretch dozens of times, and he couldn't recall ever seeing a detour here. The only roads that branched off 17 in this area were old logging routes, most of them unmaintained and impassable in winter. He grabbed his phone from the cup holder and pulled up his Maps app, but the screen showed nothing but a spinning wheel where the road data should be. No signal, not even one bar. Out here that wasn't unusual, but the timing felt wrong. The CB hissed again, and the older dispatcher's voice returned. Unit 12. Be advised that weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Highway 17 is now closed between markers 450 and 495 due to whiteout conditions and multiple vehicle incidents. All eastbound traffic is being diverted onto secondary routes. Follow detour signage and maintain radio contact. Thorne stared at the handset in his palm, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The detour sign ahead was real. He could see it clearly through the snow, its reflective surface catching his headlights. But everything about this felt off. The voices on the radio, the specific mention of marker 462, the sudden appearance of detour signage on a stretch of road he knew by heart. He thought about pulling over, waiting out the storm in his cab with the engine running for heat. But the idea of sitting still on this highway in zero visibility made his skin crawl. If another truck came barreling through the whiteout, they'd never see him until it was too late. The detour arrow pointed right, into darkness and trees. Thorne eased his rig forward, watching the turnoff approach, and made a decision. He'd follow the detour for a few kilometers, see where it led, and if it looked too sketchy or unmaintained, he'd find a safe spot to turn around and come back. The alternative, pushing forward on a closed highway in blizzard conditions, was a guaranteed way to end up in a ditch or worse. He clicked on his turn signal out of habit, even though there was no one behind him to see it, and guided his truck onto the secondary road. The transition was immediate and jarring. The pavement gave way to gravel and hardpack, and the smooth hum of highway driving became a rougher, jostling ride. His headlights illuminated a narrow corridor of white, with snow-laden evergreens pressing in on both sides. The road surface was barely visible beneath the accumulating snow, and Thorne had to rely on the faint outline of tire tracks from whoever had passed this way before him. The CB erupted with static again, louder this time, and beneath the white noise Thorne thought he heard something else. Music, maybe, or voices layered over each other in a way that didn't quite make sense. He reached over and turned the volume down, but not off. Whatever was happening on that channel, he wanted to stay aware of it even if it was just equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. The northern lights could do strange things to radio signals, he knew, and out here in the deep bush with a storm overhead, anything was possible. But the rational explanations felt thin and unconvincing, like trying to convince yourself that the shadow in your bedroom corner is just a coat rack when every instinct screams otherwise. 3 kilometers in, the road bent sharply to the left, following the contour of what Thorne guessed was a frozen lake or wetland. His trailer swung wide on the turn, and he felt the wheels lose traction for a heart-stopping moment before catching again. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and tightened his grip on the wheel. The tire tracks he'd been following were getting fainter now, filling in with fresh snow faster than seemed possible. Another few minutes and they'd be gone entirely, leaving him to navigate by instinct and hope. He thought about the voice on the radio, the one claiming to be stopped at marker 462, and wondered if that driver had made the same choice he had. Wondered if they'd followed the same detour signs into the same dark forest, and wondered what they'd found at the end of the road. The CB crackled one more time, and the young driver's voice came through again, clearer now, but no less frightened. "Dispatch, I've been on this detour for over an hour, and I haven't seen any signs telling me where to rejoin 17. My fuel's getting low, and I'm starting to think I've made a wrong turn somewhere. Can you confirm the route?" There was a pause, filled with static and the distant howl of wind. Then the dispatcher responded, his voice flat and emotionless. "Unit 12, we show you still at marker 462. You have not moved. Repeat, you have not moved. Please confirm your status." The young driver's reply was sharp, almost angry. "I'm moving. I've been driving for over an hour. I can see the trees going past. I can feel the road under my wheels. I'm moving." The desperation in his voice made Thorne's chest tighten. Another pause, longer this time, and when the dispatcher spoke again, his words chilled Thorne to the bone. "Unit 12, that's impossible. Marker 462 no longer exists. It was removed from service in 1987. Thorne's headlights caught something ahead, and he eased off the throttle instinctively. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the snow, a swirl of white caught in the beam and transformed into something solid. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into a figure standing at the side of the road. A woman dressed in what looked like a highway maintenance uniform, bright orange parka, reflective strips on the arms and legs, a hard hat pulled low over her face. She was holding a stop sign on a long pole, the kind used by flaggers at construction sites, and she stood perfectly still despite the wind and snow battering everything around her. Thorne's instinct was to slow down, to roll down his window and ask if she needed help or if there was danger ahead. But something about the way she stood there, motionless and silent, made him hesitate. Her face was hidden in shadow beneath the brim of her hard hat, and the hand gripping the sign pole didn't move, didn't adjust to the weight or the wind. She looked less like a person and more like a mannequin, placed there by some unseen hand for purposes Thorne couldn't begin to guess at. He brought his rig to a crawl, close enough now to see details. The stop sign was old, its red paint faded and chipped, and the reflective strips on her uniform looked wrong, too dull, like they'd been left out in the sun for years. Thorne reached for his window control, then stopped. Every instinct he had was screaming at him not to open that window, not to engage with whatever this was. Instead, he kept his foot on the brake and stared at the figure, waiting for some sign of movement, some indication that she was aware of his presence. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The wind howled, the snow fell. The woman stood frozen in place, her stop sign held high like a warning or a threat. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, her head began to turn toward Thorne's cab. He didn't wait to see what was beneath that hard hat. He shifted into gear and pressed down on the accelerator, feeling his tires spin briefly on the snow before catching traction. The rig lurched forward, and Thorne fixed his eyes straight ahead, refusing to look in his side mirror, refusing to see if the figure was still standing there or if she was moving, following, coming closer. The CB crackled one final time as Thorne's truck picked up speed, the static now so loud it was almost painful. Through the noise, he heard the young driver's voice, fragmented and distorted. "I see lights ahead. I think, I'm almost back to the highway. Thank God. The transmission cut off with a sound like tearing metal, and then there was nothing but silence. Thorne's hands were shaking on the wheel, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He glanced at his dashboard clock and felt his stomach drop. It read 11:47 p.m. That couldn't be right. He'd left Thunder Bay at 7, and even accounting for the slow driving in the storm, he should barely be past 9:30 or 10 at the latest. But the clock insisted otherwise, its green digits glowing steadily in the darkness of the cab. 4 hours and 47 minutes had passed since he'd pulled onto Highway 17, and Thorne couldn't account for more than half of that time. Up ahead, the trees began to thin, and Thorne caught a glimpse of something that made his chest flood with relief. The orange glow of sodium vapor lights, the kind used to illuminate highway rest stops and service centers. He pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach that light, to find other people and trucks and the blessed normalcy of a truck stop parking lot. The gravel road widened, smoothed out, and then suddenly he was back on pavement, real pavement, with painted lines and reflective markers. A sign flashed past on his right. "Welcome to Wawa, gateway to the north." Thorne's relief curdled into confusion. Wawa was at least 200 kilometers east of where he'd turned onto the detour. There was no way, no possible way, he'd covered that distance in the time that had passed. But the sign didn't lie, and as he guided his rig into the parking lot of a brightly lit Petro-Canada station, he saw other trucks lined up at the pumps, their drivers moving about in the cold like everything was perfectly normal. Thorne pulled into an empty spot, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence of his cab. His hands were still shaking. His mouth was dry. The CB radio sat quiet on its mount. No static, no voices, nothing but the soft crackle of dead air. He looked at his logbook, the physical one he kept for backup, even though everything was digital now, and opened it to today's page. The last entry he'd made was at 7:15 p.m., noting his departure from Thunder Bay. He should have made another entry by now, recording his stop at the detour or his arrival here in Wawa. But the page was blank after that first line, as if the past 4 hours had simply vanished. Thorne picked up a pen, held it over the paper, and tried to think of what to write. How do you log time that doesn't make sense? How do you explain a detour that covers 200 kilometers of highway when it should have been a simple bypass? He climbed out of his cab, his legs stiff and unsteady, and walked toward the station's convenience store. The cold hit him like a slap, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his chest. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee and hot dogs felt surreal after the darkness and isolation of the past few hours. A young clerk stood behind the counter, scrolling through her phone, and she looked up when Thorne approached. "Rough night out there," she said, nodding toward the windows where snow was still falling steadily. "You coming from the west?" Thorne nodded, not trusting his voice yet. The clerk continued, oblivious to his discomfort. "Highway 17's been closed since about 8:30. Multiple pileups near Nipigon. You must have gotten through just before they shut it down." Thorne found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "I took a detour. Signs said the highway was closed, directed me onto a secondary road." The clerk frowned, her finger pausing on her phone screen. "A detour? I haven't heard anything about detours. The closure notice just said all traffic was being turned back at the way station." She tapped her phone a few times, pulling up what looked like a highway information app. "Yeah, see? No detours listed. They're just telling people to wait it out or find a hotel." Thorne felt the floor tilt slightly beneath his feet. He steadied himself against the counter and tried to keep his voice calm. There were signs, big orange signs with arrows, directing eastbound traffic onto a secondary road. "I followed them for—" He stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. "I followed them for a while." The clerk looked at him with something between concern and suspicion. "Are you okay? You look kind of pale. Do you need me to call someone?" Thorne shook his head quickly. No, I'm fine. Just need coffee. Strong coffee." He paid for the largest cup they had and walked back out to his truck, the steam rising from the cup in ghostly wisps. The parking lot was full now, at least 20 rigs lined up in neat rows, their drivers either sleeping in their cabs or gathered inside the station for warmth and company. Thorne climbed back into his own cab and pulled out his phone. Still no signal, which was strange given that he was in a town with visible cell towers. He tried calling his dispatcher anyway, just to leave a voicemail explaining the situation, but the call wouldn't connect. Just a spinning wheel on the screen and then an error message. Network unavailable. He tried texting instead, thumbs clumsy on the small keyboard. Made it to Wawa. Weird night. We'll explain later. The message hung in limbo for several seconds before finally showing sent, but Thorne had no confidence it would actually reach its destination. He sat in the driver's seat, sipping his coffee and staring out at the falling snow, trying to piece together what had happened. The detour signs, the voices on the CB, the woman with the stop sign, the missing hours. None of it made sense individually, and together it formed a picture so strange and unsettling that his mind kept trying to reject it. There had to be a rational explanation. Equipment malfunction, atmospheric conditions playing tricks with radio signals, fatigue making him lose track of time. The problem was, none of those explanations felt adequate. They felt like excuses, like ways to avoid acknowledging the wrongness of what he'd experienced. Thorne thought about the young driver on the radio, the one who claimed to be moving but who dispatch insisted was stationary at a marker that no longer existed. He wondered if that driver had ever made it off Highway 17, or if he was still out there somewhere following a road that shouldn't exist, broadcasting on a frequency that no one could hear. The coffee was hot and bitter, and Thorne drank it quickly, letting it burn away the chill that had settled into his bones. He'd have to file a report with his insurance company, he realized, explaining the gap in his logbook and the impossible distance his truck had somehow covered. They'd probably flag it as suspicious, maybe even accuse him of falsifying records or running off book to avoid hours of service regulations. But what else could he do? Lie about where he'd been? Pretend the detour never happened? That felt worse somehow, like denying reality would give whatever he'd encountered more power, more validity. He finished the coffee and crushed the cup, tossing it into the plastic bag he kept for trash. Then he pulled out his logbook and pen, and after a long moment of hesitation he wrote, 11:47 p.m. Arrived Wawa via unscheduled detour. Details unclear. Vehicle and cargo secure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the parking lot in white. Thorne reclined his seat and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he started to drift off, he'd jerk awake with the image of that woman in his mind, the highway maintenance worker with the stop sign, standing motionless in the storm. He'd see her face, or rather, the absence of her face, just shadow and darkness beneath the brim of that hard hat. And he'd hear the dispatcher's voice, flat and certain. Marker 462 no longer exists. It was removed from service in 1987. Thorne didn't know what that meant, didn't know if it meant anything at all. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never take that stretch of Highway 17 at night again. Not in a storm, not in clear weather, not for any amount of money. Some roads, he was beginning to realize, didn't follow the rules. Some roads went places that weren't on any map, and the drivers who followed them didn't always come back the same, if they came back at all. Thorne woke to the sound of diesel engines rumbling to life around him, and for a confused moment he didn't know where he was. The inside of his cab was cold, condensation frosting the edges of his windows, and pale morning light filtered through the snow-covered windshield. He sat up slowly, his neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle, and looked around the parking lot. Half the trucks that had been there last night were gone, their drivers having gotten an early start now that the storm had passed. The Petro-Canada station looked different in daylight. Smaller, less welcoming, just another roadside stop in a chain of identical stops stretching across the country. Thorne checked his phone and found he had signal again, 3 bars showing in the corner of the screen. He had a dozen missed calls from his dispatcher and a string of increasingly worried text messages asking where he was and why his GPS tracker had gone offline for over 6 hours. He called back immediately, and his dispatcher picked up on the second ring. The man's voice was tight with frustration and relief in equal measure. "Merriweather, what the hell happened? Your tracker showed you leaving Thunder Bay and then nothing. Just a blank spot on the map until you popped back up in Wawa 4 hours later. Did you have equipment failure?" Thorne rubbed his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts into something that wouldn't sound insane. "I hit the storm on 17, got diverted onto a detour because of highway closure. My phone lost signal, GPS must have cut out. I made it to Wawa and pulled in here to wait out the weather." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Thorne could hear the clicking of computer keys. "I'm not showing any official detour on Highway 17 last night. The highway was closed at Nipigon, yeah, but all eastbound traffic was being turned around and sent back west. No detours were authorized." Thorne's grip tightened on his phone. There were signs. Big orange reflective signs with arrows. I followed them because I wasn't going to sit in whiteout conditions on a closed highway. More clicking sounds, and then his dispatcher's voice came back, quieter now, more concerned. "Thorne, listen to me carefully. What kind of signs? Who put them up?" The question hung in the air between them, and Thorne realized he didn't have an answer. He'd assumed they were official highway department signs, but thinking back, he couldn't recall seeing any logos or official markings. Just orange and white, arrows pointing into the darkness. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I thought they were legit. They looked real enough." His dispatcher sighed, the sound crackling through the phone's speaker. "Look, I'm going to need you to file a detailed incident report when you get to your delivery point. The client's already pissed about the delay, but I can smooth that over. What I can't explain is a 6-hour GPS blackout and 200 kilometers covered in half the time it should have taken. That's going to raise flags with the insurance company and maybe with the MTO if they decide to look into it." Thorne ended the call feeling worse than before, and he sat in his cab staring at the dashboard instruments as if they might provide some answers. His tachograph, the digital device that recorded his driving hours, speeds, and distances, showed a strange gap in its data logs. According to the readout, he'd been driving continuously from 7:15 p.m. until 11:47 p.m., covering 237 kilometers at an average speed that shouldn't have been possible given the storm conditions. But the weird part was the fuel consumption data. His tank level showed almost exactly what it should have for the distance traveled, which meant his engine had been running, his wheels had been turning, and yet somehow he'd moved through space faster than the conditions should have allowed. Thorne pulled out his paper logbook again and flipped back through previous entries, looking for something, anything that might make sense of what had happened. His eyes landed on an entry from 3 weeks ago, a note he'd scribbled in the margins while waiting at a truck stop in Kenora. Talked to Oldtimer about Highway 17 ghost stories. Said there used to be a marker 462 near Red Rock, site of bad accident in the 80s. Marker removed after families complained. The memory came flooding back now. He'd been having coffee in a diner when an elderly trucker at the next table overheard him talking about his route and struck up a conversation. The old man had been driving Northern Ontario routes since the 1970s, back when the Trans-Canada was still being upgraded and expanded, and he'd told Thorne about a massive pile-up that had happened during a November blizzard in 1986. 7 vehicles involved, including 3 transport trucks, and the final death toll had been 14 people. The accident happened at a spot marked by kilometer post 462, and in the aftermath, families of the victims had petitioned to have the marker removed and renumbered. They didn't want a permanent reminder of where their loved ones had died, didn't want other drivers slowing down to gawk at the site. The highway department had complied, and marker 462 simply ceased to exist. The road went from 461 to 463, with that kilometer of asphalt becoming a kind of official blank space on the map. Thorne hadn't thought much about the story at the time. Every highway had its share of tragedy and ghost stories, and he'd heard dozens of them over the years. But now, remembering the voice on the CB radio insisting that Unit 12 was stopped at marker 462, the story took on a darker significance. He pulled out his phone and did a search for Highway 17 Accident 1986 Red Rock, and the results that came back made his stomach clench. There had indeed been a major accident, and the details matched what the old trucker had told him. But there was one additional piece of information that Thorne hadn't heard before. One of the trucks involved in the pileup had been hauling chemicals, and the impact had ruptured the tank, spilling its contents across the highway and into the surrounding forest. The chemical was never fully identified in the news reports, just described as hazardous industrial solvent, but the cleanup had taken weeks and required the highway to be closed for an extended period. Thorne scrolled through more search results and found a scanned newspaper article from 1987 discussing the marker removal and the memorial service held for the victims. At the bottom of the article was a list of names, and one of them made Thorne's blood run cold. Elgin Rousseau, 53, dispatcher for Northern Ontario Transport Services. Thorne stared at the name, trying to convince himself it was a coincidence, but his hands had started shaking again. The voice on the CB, The one that had been communicating with Unit 12 had sounded exactly like what Thorne would imagine a veteran dispatcher to sound like. Gravelly, authoritative, with that particular cadence that came from decades of radio communication. He thought about that voice saying, "Unit 12, we show you still at marker 462. You have not moved." And he thought about the younger voice responding in panic and confusion, insisting that he was moving, that he could see the trees going by. Thorne closed the browser on his phone and took several deep breaths, trying to slow his racing heart. There had to be an explanation. Radio signals bouncing off the ionosphere could pick up transmissions from years or even decades ago under the right atmospheric conditions. He'd heard about that phenomenon, something called skip, or propagation, where CB signals traveled thousands of miles and arrived delayed and distorted. But that didn't explain the detour signs, or the woman with the stop sign, or the missing hours in his logbook. It didn't explain how he'd covered 200 kilometers in conditions that should have kept him crawling at 50 kilometers per hour. Thorne climbed out of his cab and walked into the Petro-Canada station, needing to move, needing to be around other people. Inside, the same clerk from last night was still behind the counter, though she looked exhausted and ready for her shift to end. She gave him a tired smile as he approached. "Still here? I figured you'd be long gone by now. Highway reopened about 2 hours ago." Thorne grabbed another coffee from the self-serve machine and brought it to the counter. "Yeah, I needed to catch some sleep. Long night." The clerk nodded sympathetically. "I bet. We had drivers coming in all night with stories about the conditions out there. One guy said he saw a moose standing in the middle of the road and had to swerve so hard he nearly jackknifed. Another said his CB was picking up nothing but static and weird voices." Thorne's hand froze halfway to his wallet. "Weird voices? What kind of voices?" The clerk shrugged, scanning his coffee. "I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention. You know how truckers get when they've been on the road too long? Everything starts to sound spooky. That'll be $3.50. Thorne paid and was about to leave when the clerk added, "Oh, but there was one guy who said something interesting. He'd pulled off onto one of the old logging roads to wait out the worst of the storm, and when he tried to get back onto 17, he couldn't find the turnoff. Said it was like the road had just vanished. He drove up and down the same stretch 3 times before he finally found a different way back to the highway." She laughed, shaking her head. Probably just got disoriented in the snow, but he seemed pretty freaked out about it. Thorne thanked her and walked back outside, his coffee steaming in the cold morning air. The story the clerk had told him was too close to his own experience to be coincidence, and it raised a disturbing possibility. What if he wasn't the only one who'd encountered those detour signs last night? What if other drivers had followed the same route, taken the same wrong turn, and ended up lost in those endless forest roads? He thought about Unit 12 again, the panicked voice insisting he was moving while dispatch said he was stationary. What if that driver had never made it back to the highway? What if he was still out there somewhere, following a road that looped back on itself endlessly, his fuel gauge dropping toward empty while trees and snow scrolled past his windows in an infinite repetition? Thorne shook his head, trying to dispel the dark thoughts. He needed to get moving, needed to complete his delivery and put this whole experience behind him. But as he walked back toward his truck, something caught his eye. There was a vehicle parked at the far end of the lot, partially hidden behind a snowbank. It was an older pickup truck, painted in the yellow and orange colors of the Ontario Highway Maintenance Department, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a layer of snow covering its windshield. What made Thorne stop and stare was the figure sitting in the driver's seat. Even through the snow-covered window he could make out the silhouette. A person wearing what looked like a hard hat, sitting perfectly still, not moving at all, despite the fact that the truck's engine clearly wasn't running. Thorne took a few steps closer, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, and the figure's head turned slightly toward him. For just a moment, he thought he saw the same shadowed face from last night, the absence of features beneath the brim of that hard hat. But then a gust of wind blew snow across the parking lot, momentarily obscuring his view, and when it cleared, the truck was empty. No figure in the driver's seat, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Just an abandoned maintenance vehicle, probably left there months or even years ago and forgotten. Thorne stood frozen for several long seconds, staring at the empty truck before forcing himself to turn away and continue toward his own rig. His imagination was running wild now, seeing patterns and connections where none existed. Lack of sleep and stress were making him paranoid, that was all. He needed to get back on the road, complete his delivery, and take a few days off to clear his head. He climbed into his cab and started the engine, letting it warm up while he checked his route one more time. The delivery was in Sault Ste. Marie, still another 200 kilometers east on Highway 17. Under normal conditions, it would be an easy 3-hour drive, but given the road conditions and the fact that plows were probably still working to clear last night's accumulation, he was looking at 4 or 5 hours minimum. Thorne pulled out of the parking lot and merged back onto the Trans-Canada, heading east into the pale morning light. The highway had been plowed since the storm, but there was still packed snow on the shoulders and black ice lurking in the shadows where the sun hadn't reached yet. He kept his speed conservative, staying in the right lane and letting faster traffic pass him when they wanted to. The CB radio crackled occasionally with traffic from other drivers. Normal conversations about road conditions and weather forecasts. Nothing strange or unsettling. Thorne kept the volume low but audible, part of him still listening for that dispatcher's voice, for any sign that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. About 40 minutes east of Wawa, Thorne passed a highway maintenance depot set back from the road. He glanced at it as he drove by, noting the lineup of yellow plows and salt trucks, and something made him hit his brakes and pull onto the shoulder. He sat there with his 4-ways flashing, staring at the depot through his passenger window, trying to figure out what had caught his attention. Then he saw it. Parked among the other maintenance vehicles was a truck identical to the one he'd seen in the Petro-Canada parking lot. Same yellow and orange paint scheme, same rust patterns, same model and year by the look of it. But this one was clearly still in service, with fresh tire tracks in the snow around it, and steam rising from its exhaust pipe. Thorne grabbed his phone and pulled up the photos he'd taken yesterday during his pre-trip inspection, scrolling through until he found the ones he'd snapped while fueling up in Thunder Bay. In the background of one photo, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a highway maintenance truck parked at the station. He zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as his phone would allow, and felt his breath catch in his throat. The truck in his photo had a unit number painted on its door, M462. He stared at that number, his mind racing through the implications. The truck he'd seen last night in Wawa, the woman with the stop sign standing in the middle of the detour road. What if they were connected to that long-ago accident at marker 462? What if Maida Kincross, whoever she was, had been part of the cleanup crew or the investigation team, and something about that night in 1986 had left an imprint on the highway itself? Thorne didn't believe in ghosts, had never put much stock in supernatural explanations for things, but he was running out of rational alternatives. The evidence in front of him, the radio transmissions, the impossible detour, the missing time, the maintenance truck appearing and disappearing, pointed toward something that operated outside the normal rules of cause and effect. Something that existed in the gaps between one moment and the next, in the blank spaces on the map where marker 462 used to be. He pulled back onto the highway and continued east, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he checked his mirrors, he half expected to see that yellow maintenance truck following him, or the woman with the stop sign standing at the side of the road. The kilometers ticked by slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last, and Thorne found himself counting down the distance to Sault Ste. Marie like a mantra. 160 kilometers, 140, 120. Every marker he passed felt like a small victory, proof that he was still moving forward in real time and real space. But the anxiety didn't ease, and by the time he finally saw the city limits sign for Sault Ste. Marie, his shoulders were tight with tension, and his hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too hard. He made his delivery without incident, backing his trailer up to the loading dock and waiting while the warehouse crew unloaded his cargo. The normalcy of it all. The forklift operators chatting about hockey scores, the supervisor checking items off on his clipboard, the smell of diesel and cardboard, helped ground him in the present moment. When the paperwork was signed and his trailer was empty, Thorne drove to a truck stop on the outskirts of the city and parked in a spot near the main building where there were plenty of other trucks and people around. He wasn't ready to be alone in his cab again, wasn't ready to face the silence and the questions that came with it. Inside the truck stop restaurant, he ordered a full breakfast even though it was past lunchtime. Eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, and coffee. The food was mediocre at best, but it was hot and substantial, and eating it gave him something to focus on besides the events of the previous night. At the next table over, two truckers were deep in conversation, and Thorne couldn't help but overhear fragments of what they were saying. Heard from Kovacs that Highway 17 was a nightmare last night, one of them said, a heavy-set man with a salt and pepper beard. Multiple closures, accidents everywhere. He said some guys are reporting weird stuff on their CB radios, like old transmissions from years ago coming through. The other trucker, younger, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, laughed. Kovacs is full of shit. Next, he'll be telling us about UFOs and Bigfoot. But the bearded man shook his head seriously. Nah, man, I'm telling you. Something strange happens on that stretch of road during bad storms. I've heard stories going back decades. Drivers seeing things that aren't there, losing time, ending up miles from where they should be. There's something about the geography out there, the way the rock formations, and the lakes and the magnetic fields all line up. It plays tricks on your instruments, on your perception. The younger trucker wasn't buying it. So, what? You think the highway is haunted or something? The bearded man shrugged. I don't know what I think. All I know is I've been driving this route for 20 years, and I've learned to respect it. Especially that stretch between Nipigon and Wawa. You don't take chances there, you don't push your luck, and if something feels wrong, you pull over and wait it out. Thorne wanted to lean over and tell them everything that had happened to him. Wanted to ask if they'd ever heard of Marker 462, or a dispatcher named Elgin Rousseau, or a maintenance worker named Maida Kincross, but he knew how it would sound, like the ravings of an overtired driver who'd been on the road too long. So instead, he finished his breakfast in silence, paid his bill, and walked back out to his truck. The afternoon sun was already starting to dip toward the horizon, and Thorne realized that his next scheduled run wasn't for another 3 days. He had time to go home, to sleep in his own bed, to try to process everything that had happened. But first he needed to do one more thing. He pulled out his phone and searched for Maida Kincross Ontario Highway Maintenance, and what came back made his hands go cold. There was an obituary from 1986, published in the Thunder Bay Chronicle-Journal. Maida Kincross, 41, highway maintenance supervisor, killed in the line of duty during a November blizzard while directing traffic around a major accident scene near Red Rock. The article described how she'd been standing at a detour point, guiding vehicles onto a temporary route when a transport truck lost control on the ice and struck her. She'd died instantly. The photo accompanying the obituary showed a woman in a highway maintenance uniform, hard hat on, holding a stop sign. Her face was partially obscured by the shadow of the hat's brim, but Thorne could see enough to know it was the same figure he'd seen last night on that dark detour road. The same stillness, the same posture, the same sense of waiting for something that would never come. Thorne sat in his truck with the engine idling, staring at that photo, and finally allowed himself to accept what he'd been trying to deny. Whatever had happened to him on Highway 17 last night hadn't been equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference or fatigue-induced hallucination. He'd driven through something else entirely, some echo of that terrible night in 1986 when 14 people died and the highway swallowed a piece of itself. He'd followed detour signs that Maida Kincross had put up 37 years ago, had driven on roads that shouldn't exist anymore, and had somehow emerged on the other side with nothing but missing time and questions that had no good answers. He put his truck in gear and headed for the highway on-ramp, pointing west toward home. The drive would take him back through the same stretch of Highway 17 where everything had gone wrong, but this time he'd do it in daylight. And this time he'd be ready for anything. Or so he told himself. As the kilometers unwound behind him and the sun sank lower in the sky, Thorne kept his eyes on the road ahead and his hand near the CB radio, listening for voices that shouldn't exist. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about Unit 12, about that young driver who'd insisted he was moving while dispatch said he was stationary at a marker that no longer existed. Thorne wondered if that driver had ever found his way out of the detour, or if he was still out there somewhere, trapped in an endless loop of snow and darkness, following signs that led nowhere. The thought made him press a little harder on the accelerator, eager to put miles between himself and whatever haunted that section of highway. But even as he drove, he knew he'd never really leave it behind. Some roads get into your head and stay there, and Highway 17 was now one of them. The westbound drive back through northern Ontario should have been routine, but Thorne found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter every time he approached a kilometer marker in the 450s and 460s. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway, and the snowbanks on either side of the road looked like frozen waves, sculpted by the wind into shapes that seemed almost intentional. He'd left Sault Ste. Marie just after 2 in the afternoon, and the plan was to make it back to Thunder Bay by evening, stopping only for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. But as he drew closer to the stretch of highway where everything had gone wrong the night before, Thorne felt an almost physical resistance, like his truck was pushing against an invisible current. The rational part of his mind told him it was just the wind, just the residual effects of the storm, but his gut knew better. Something about this section of road had changed for him, and he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to drive it the same way again. Around kilometer marker 470, Thorne's CB radio crackled to life with normal traffic. A westbound driver asking about road conditions ahead, another responding that it was clear sailing all the way to Thunder Bay. Thorne listened without contributing, his thumb resting on the transmit button but never quite pressing it. He wasn't ready to engage with other drivers yet. Wasn't ready to pretend that everything was normal when his logbook still had that unexplained gap, and his tachograph data still showed impossible travel times. The company he contracted for had been understanding so far, but he knew questions would come eventually. Insurance companies didn't like mysteries, and neither did the Ministry of Transportation. Someone would want answers, and Thorne had nothing to give them except a story that sounded like it belonged on a late-night radio show about paranormal experiences. He could already imagine the skeptical looks, the suggestions that maybe he needed a mental health evaluation, the possibility that his commercial driver's license could be suspended pending investigation. He passed the exit for Wawa and felt a small surge of relief that he hadn't needed to stop there again. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening, more mundane, but Thorne couldn't shake the memory of that maintenance truck in the parking lot. the figure that had been there and then wasn't. He checked his mirrors compulsively now, scanning for yellow vehicles, for anyone who might be following him, and he knew the paranoia was getting worse rather than better. This was how accidents happened, he reminded himself. This was how good drivers ended up in ditches, or worse, because they were too distracted by their own thoughts to focus on the road. Thorne forced himself to take a deep breath and consciously relax his shoulders. He had another 150 kilometers to go before Thunder Bay, and he needed to keep his head clear for all of them. But even as he tried to center himself, his eyes kept drifting to the odometer, watching the numbers tick upward, counting down the distance to where he'd turned onto that detour the night before. At kilometer marker 487, Thorne slowed down without meaning to. This was where he'd seen the first detour sign, where he'd made the decision to leave Highway 17 and follow those orange arrows into the forest. In daylight, the spot looked completely ordinary, just a widening of the shoulder where the highway department probably stored gravel and salt in the summer months. There was no turnoff visible, no secondary road branching away into the trees, nothing to suggest that another route even existed. Thorne pulled onto the shoulder and put his truck in park, leaving the engine running while he climbed out to take a closer look. The cold hit him immediately, but he ignored it, walking along the edge of the pavement and staring into the tree line. The forest was dense here, black spruce and jack pine growing so close together that he couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet into the shadows. Snow covered everything in a thick white blanket, pristine and undisturbed. No tire tracks, no sign that any vehicle had ever turned off the highway at this point. Thorne walked further along the shoulder, his boots crunching in the packed snow, and that's when he noticed something odd. There were marks in the snowbank, parallel lines about 8 feet apart, like something heavy had been dragged through. The marks led from the highway shoulder toward the trees, and they were partially filled in with fresh snow but still visible enough to trace. Thorne followed them carefully, climbing over the snowbank and pushing through the underbrush at the forest's edge. About 15 feet in, he found what he was looking for, or rather, what he'd been dreading to find. There was a road here, or at least there had been. The pavement was old and broken, barely visible beneath the snow and decades of organic debris, but it was definitely man-made. Thorne could see the faint outline of asphalt through gaps in the snow, and when he kicked away some of the accumulation with his boot, he revealed a painted line, faded yellow, the kind used to mark the center of a 2-lane road. This was where he'd turned last night. This was the detour he'd followed into darkness and lost time. He pulled out his phone and took several photos, documenting the hidden road and the marks in the snowbank. The photos looked innocuous enough on his phone's screen, just snow and trees and broken pavement. But Thorne knew what they represented. This was evidence that the detour had been real, that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. But it also raised more questions than it answered. If this road existed, why wasn't it on any map? Why had the clerk in Wawa insisted there were no authorized detours? And most importantly, where did this road actually go? Thorne considered walking further along the old pavement, following it deeper into the forest to see where it led. But something stopped him. The shadows under the trees seemed darker than they should be, even accounting for the thick canopy, and the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no wind rustling through branches, nothing but the distant sound of traffic on Highway 17 behind him. It felt wrong. Felt like trespassing in a place where he wasn't welcome, and Thorne's instincts screamed at him to get back to his truck and leave this place behind. He climbed back over the snowbank and returned to his rig, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled himself up into the cab. The warmth inside was a relief, but it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled into his bones. Thorne sat in the driver's seat for several long minutes, staring at the photos on his phone and trying to decide what to do with them. He could send them to his dispatcher, could file them with his incident report and let someone else figure out what they meant. But what if that led to more questions he couldn't answer? What if it led to investigations and interviews and eventually to losing his license because no one believed his story? The alternative was to delete the photos and say nothing, to pretend the detour had been a figment of storm-induced confusion, and to carry the weight of what he'd experienced alone. Neither option felt right. But Thorne wasn't sure he had the strength to fight for the truth when the truth itself was so slippery and strange. He pulled back onto the highway and continued west, but his mind kept returning to that hidden road and the question of where it went. According to his tachograph, he'd driven for over 4 hours on that detour, covering more than 200 kilometers at speeds that shouldn't have been possible on an old logging road in the middle of a blizzard. The math didn't work, the physics didn't work, and yet his truck's instruments insisted it had happened. Thorne thought about the maintenance worker he'd seen standing in the middle of the road, Maida Kincross in her orange parka and hard hat, holding that stop sign like a barrier between one world and another. He thought about the obituary he'd found, the description of how she'd died directing traffic around an accident scene. What if she was still doing that even now? What if some part of her remained at her post, still trying to save drivers from the same fate that had killed 14 people in 1986? The idea should have been comforting in a strange way, but instead it filled Thorne with a deep sadness. If his theory was right, then Maida Kincross had been trapped on that road for 37 years, reliving the same terrible night over and over, unable to rest or move on. About 20 kilometers past the hidden turnoff, Thorne's CB radio erupted with a burst of static so loud and sudden that he nearly swerved into the other lane. He reached over and turned down the volume, but the static continued, punctuated now by that same hollow voice he'd heard the night before. Unit 12, this is dispatch. Your transponder shows anomalous readings. Please confirm your current kilometer marker and direction of travel. Thorne's blood went cold. He grabbed the handset, almost dropping it in his haste, and keyed the transmit button. This is Merriweather, westbound at marker 468. Who is this? What frequency are you broadcasting on? The static intensified for a moment, then cleared slightly, and the dispatcher's voice came through with eerie clarity. Merriweather, you are not authorized on this channel. Please switch to public frequency and maintain radio silence. Before Thorne could respond, a different voice cut in. Younger. Panicked. The same one from last night. I can see lights behind me now. Someone's following me. Dispatch, there's another vehicle on this road and they're gaining on me fast. Thorne's eyes shot to his mirrors, scanning the highway behind him, but there was nothing there except empty pavement and the last light of the setting sun. The voice on the radio continued, breathless and terrified. They're right on my bumper now. They're flashing their lights. I don't know what they want. The transmission cut off with a sound like tearing metal, the same sound Thorne had heard last night, and then there was nothing but the soft hiss of dead air. Thorne stared at the CB radio, his heart hammering in his chest, and without thinking he pressed the transmit button again. Unit 12, if you can hear me, get off that road. Find a place to turn around, get back to the highway. That road doesn't go anywhere good. Silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity, and Thorne was about to try again when a response crackled through. Who is this? How do you know about the road? The young driver's voice was suspicious now, edged with fear and confusion. Dispatch said I was the only unit in this sector. Thorne chose his words carefully, aware that he might be talking to an echo, a recording, something that existed outside normal time. My name is Thorne Merriweather. I'm a trucker, same as you. I drove that same detour last night during the storm, and I made it out. You can too, but you need to turn around now. Another long pause, and when the voice came back it sounded younger than before, almost childlike in its vulnerability. "I don't know how to turn around. The road's too narrow, and there's something wrong with my instruments. My GPS is showing me in the middle of Lake Superior, and my odometer stopped working about an hour ago. I don't even know how much fuel I have left." Thorne's grip tightened on the handset. "Listen to me very carefully. Stop your truck wherever you are right now. Don't drive any further. Set your parking brake and turn on your four-ways. Can you do that?" He heard the sound of air brakes hissing through the static, then the young driver's voice again. "Okay, I'm stopped. Now what?" Thorne wasn't sure how to answer that question. He'd made it out of the detour, but he didn't know how or why. He'd just kept driving until the road deposited him back on Highway 17, hours and kilometers from where he should have been. But he couldn't tell this other driver to do the same thing, couldn't encourage him to keep going when the road itself might be the trap. "Stay where you are," Thorne said finally. "Stay in your cab, keep your engine running for heat, and wait. Someone will come for you." Even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Who would come? The highway department didn't know about that road. Dispatch couldn't track transponders that showed impossible locations. And if the young driver was actually calling from 1986, trapped in the same loop as Elgin Rousseau, and made a kin cross, then no help was coming. No help had ever come. The realization hit Thorne like a physical blow, and he pulled onto the shoulder again, unable to continue driving while his mind raced through the implications. He sat with the engine idling, staring at the CB radio and waiting for another transmission, but none came. The static had faded to background noise, and the frequency was quiet again, except for the occasional burst of normal trucker chatter. Thorne checked his phone and saw that it was approaching 5 in the evening. He'd been on the road for nearly 3 hours since leaving Sault Ste. Marie, and he still had over 100 kilometers to go before Thunder Bay. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something unfinished back there, that by driving away from that hidden turnoff he was abandoning the young driver to his fate. Thorne grabbed his logbook and flipped back through the pages, looking for the entry he'd made 3 weeks ago after talking to that old-timer in Kenora. The trucker's name had been... he couldn't remember, but there'd been a phone number scrawled in the margin, a contact for anyone who wants to hear more stories about Highway 17. Thorne found the number and dialed it, not knowing what he'd say but needing to talk to someone who might understand. The phone rang 4 times before an elderly man's voice answered, rough with age and cigarettes. "Yeah?" Thorne took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "My name is Thorne Merriweather. We talked a few weeks ago at a truck stop in Kenora. You told me about the accident at marker 462, about how the marker got removed." There was a long pause on the other end, and Thorne heard the sound of a door closing and footsteps on what sounded like a wooden floor. "I remember you," the old man said finally. "You're the one who was asking about the old routes. What's happened?" Thorne told him everything. The storm, the detour signs, the voices on the CB, finding the hidden road, hearing Unit 12's transmissions again today. He expected skepticism or dismissal, but instead the old man just listened in silence until Thorne ran out of words. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with old grief and resignation. "You drove the ghost road," the old man said. "I've heard about it from maybe half a dozen drivers over the years. Most of them don't talk about it, don't want people thinking they've lost their minds, but it's real, or real enough anyway." Thorne's hand tightened on his phone. "What is it? What's actually happening out there?" The old man was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. "Near as I can figure, that accident in '86 did something to the highway. Maybe it was the chemicals that spilled. Maybe it was just the sheer amount of death and suffering concentrated in one spot. But that stretch of road between Nipigon and Wawa, it's not entirely stable anymore. During bad storms, when conditions match what they were like that night, the road remembers. It plays back what happened, and sometimes drivers get caught up in it. They take a detour that existed 37 years ago, follow emergency signs that were put up by people who are long dead, and when they come out the other side, if they come out, they've lost time and distance in ways that don't make sense. Thorne thought about his tachograph readings, his GPS blackout, the impossible average speed. But I made it through. I made it back to normal road. You did, the old man agreed. Not everyone does. There's at least 3 drivers I know of who went into that detour and never came out. Their trucks were found eventually, sometimes months later, but always way off in the bush where they shouldn't have been able to drive. Empty tanks, no sign of the drivers themselves, just abandoned rigs with logbooks that told impossible stories. Thorne felt his stomach twist. What about Unit 12? The driver I heard on the radio, is he real? The old man's voice dropped lower, and Thorne had to press the phone harder against his ear to hear him. There was a driver named Paul Gagnon who disappeared during that storm in 1986. He was hauling electronics from Toronto to Thunder Bay, rookie driver on his first winter run. Last anyone heard from him was around 11 at night, calling in his position at marker 462 and saying visibility was 0. They found his truck 3 months later, about 40 kilometers north of the highway, buried in snow. Fuel tank was bone dry, but the odometer showed he'd driven over 500 kilometers after his last check-in. Impossible distance, impossible route. His body was never found. Thorne closed his eyes, and in his mind he could see that young driver sitting in his cab, watching his fuel gauge drop toward empty, following a road that went nowhere. "Is he still out there?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Some part of him is," the old man said. "Same as Elgin Rousseau, same as Maida Kincross. They're stuck in that night, reliving it over and over. And when conditions are right, when another driver makes the same wrong turn, they try to help. Elgin tries to guide drivers back to the highway. Maida tries to warn them off the detour. But they can't change what happened to them, and most of the time they can't save anyone else either." Thorne opened his eyes and stared out at the darkening highway. "I heard Paul today. He said something was following him, flashing lights. What was that?" The old man's answer was grim. "That was the truck that hit Maida. The driver lost control on the ice, went into a skid, couldn't stop. He survived the impact, but she didn't. In the loop, the recording, whatever you want to call it, that truck is always there, always coming up behind anyone who's on that road. It's part of the pattern, part of what makes the whole thing repeat." Thorne felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. "Is there anything we can do? Any way to help them?" The old man was quiet for so long that Thorne thought he'd hung up. Then he spoke, and his voice was soft, with something like pity. "The only thing you can do is stay off that road. Don't drive Highway 17 in blizzard conditions, especially not at night. And if you see detour signs that don't feel right, that don't match what you know about the road, turn around and go back the way you came. Don't follow them, no matter how official they look, because once you're on that ghost road, you're playing by its rules, and the house always wins." Thorne thanked him and ended the call, sitting in the growing darkness of his cab with the engine still idling. The old man's words echoed in his mind. The house always wins. But Thorne had won, hadn't he? He'd driven the ghost road and come out the other side alive and intact, with nothing but missing time and unexplained readings to show for it. Unless that wasn't the end of it. unless the road wasn't done with him yet. He pulled up his tachograph data on the dashboard display and scrolled through the records from last night, looking for anything he might have missed. The gap in the data was still there, that 4-hour window where his truck had apparently been both moving and stationary, covering distance at speeds that violated physics. But as he examined the readout more closely, Thorne noticed something new. At the exact moment when his GPS had come back online and his truck's position had reappeared in Wawa, there was a notation he hadn't seen before. It was just a single line of text in the error log, printed in small font at the bottom of the screen. Geofence breach. Unauthorized zone entry detected. Location data corrupted. Thorne stared at that message, his mind racing. Geofencing was technology that created virtual boundaries and triggered alerts when a vehicle entered or left a defined area. His truck's GPS system had basic geofencing for border crossings and way station approaches, but he'd never seen it trigger an unauthorized zone alert before. He hadn't even known his system could generate that kind of message. He tapped the screen, trying to access more details about the error, but the system just displayed a loading icon that spun endlessly without resolving. After a minute of waiting, Thorne gave up and switched back to the main display. But the seed of an idea had been planted. What if his truck's GPS had detected something last night, some boundary or zone that shouldn't exist? What if the ghost road had a kind of digital signature that his instruments had picked up even when his conscious mind didn't understand what was happening? Thorne pulled out his phone and opened his trucking company's driver portal app. Every truck in the fleet had its movements tracked and recorded, and drivers could access their own data through the app for logbook verification and route planning. He navigated to last night's trip record and pulled up the map view, expecting to see the same blank space that his dispatcher had mentioned. Instead, what he saw made his breath catch. There was a route traced on the map, but it didn't follow Highway 17. Instead, it showed his truck veering off the main highway at marker 487 and following a thin gray line that wound north and east through areas marked as Crownland, no public access. The gray line meandered through the digital forest for what looked like hundreds of kilometers, twisting and turning in ways that no real road would, before finally reconnecting with Highway 17 at Wawa. Thorne zoomed in on the route, trying to see more detail, but the gray line stayed stubbornly vague, with no street name or route number attached to it. It was just there, a ghost in the mapping data, proof that his truck had traveled somewhere that officially didn't exist. He took screenshots of the map, saving them to his phone's memory, and then tried to zoom in further on the point where his route had left the highway. As the map expanded, more details appeared. A notation in small text that read, Historical Route 17A, decommissioned 1987, no maintenance. Thorne felt his pulse quicken. Route 17A. That was the detour he'd followed, the road that had deposited him in Wawa hours and kilometers from where he should have been. But if it was decommissioned in 1987, why did it still exist in his GPS data? Why could his truck navigate it successfully enough to record a complete route? He saved the screenshots and then opened his photo gallery, pulling up the images he'd taken earlier of the hidden road at marker 487. When he looked at them now, with the knowledge of what that road was, the photos took on a darker quality. The broken pavement, the faded yellow line, the marks in the snow that suggested recent passage, all of it pointed to a road that existed in multiple states at once. Physically present, but officially absent, decommissioned, but still navigable. Dead, but not yet buried. Thorne thought about Paul Gagnon driving that road in 1986, following what he thought was a legitimate detour around an accident scene, and ending up 40 kilometers off course with an empty tank and no way home. He thought about the other drivers the old man had mentioned, The ones who'd vanished into the bush and left nothing behind but abandoned trucks and impossible logbook entries. And he thought about himself, about how close he'd come to joining them. The only thing that had saved him was dumb luck, or maybe divine intervention, being able to keep his truck moving forward until the loop spit him out. As darkness settled fully over the highway, Thorne made a decision. He would continue west to Thunder Bay tonight, but tomorrow he would go to the Ontario Provincial Police Detachment and file a formal report about what he'd experienced. He would show them the photos, the GPS data, the tachograph readings, everything. Let them think he was crazy if they wanted to. Let them suspend his license or mandate a psychological evaluation. It didn't matter anymore because keeping silent felt like being complicit in a trap that would catch other drivers. If there was even a chance that his testimony could prevent someone else from making that wrong turn, from following those detour signs into oblivion, then it was worth whatever consequences came his way. He pulled back onto Highway 17 and drove west into the gathering night, watching his mirrors more carefully than ever before. The kilometers passed slowly, each marker bringing him closer to the safety of Thunder Bay and further from the stretch of road where reality bent in ways it shouldn't. But even as distance accumulated behind him, Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that he was still connected to that place, still tied to the ghost road by invisible threads that would never fully break. His CB radio remained quiet for the rest of the drive. No static, no phantom voices, just the normal chatter of drivers discussing weather and traffic. But Thorne kept the volume up anyway, listening for any sign that Paul Gagnon or Elgin Rousseau or Maida Kincross might break through again. Some part of him hoped they would. Hoped he could hear confirmation that they were still out there, still trying to save others from their fate. But another part of him, the part that wanted to sleep soundly again and drive without fear, hoped for nothing but silence. The highway stretched ahead, reflective markers glowing in his headlights like a runway leading home, and Thorne followed them with the determination of a man who'd seen behind the curtain of normal reality and didn't much like what he'd found there. Tomorrow would bring questions and consequences, but tonight he just needed to make it home. Everything else could wait until morning. Thorne made it back to Thunder Bay just after 9 that evening, pulling into his usual parking spot at the storage yard where he kept his truck between runs. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting. The chain-link fence, the security lights casting orange pools on the gravel, the other trucks lined up in neat rows like sleeping giants. But as he climbed out of his cab and locked the door, Thorne felt no relief, only a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. He'd been awake for nearly 40 hours straight, and the events of the past 2 days had left him hollowed out, running on nothing but coffee and nervous energy. His apartment was only a 10-minute drive away, but those 10 minutes felt like crossing a vast distance, leaving behind the world of highways and CB radios and entering a space where normal rules applied, where roads went where they were supposed to go, and time moved in predictable increments, and the dead stayed buried instead of directing traffic in endless loops. He showered until the hot water ran cold, then collapsed into bed without bothering to eat. Sleep came quickly, but brought no peace. His dreams were filled with snow and static, with yellow maintenance trucks appearing and disappearing in his mirrors, with kilometer markers that counted down instead of up. He dreamed of driving a road that curved back on itself like a Mobius strip, passing the same trees and the same rock cuts over and over, while his fuel gauge dropped inexorably toward empty. And through it all, a voice on the CB radio kept asking for his position, kept insisting he hadn't moved, kept telling him that marker 462 no longer existed. When Thorne jerked awake just after dawn, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, the dream faded, but the unease remained. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the ordinary sounds of morning traffic outside his window, and tried to convince himself that he was safe now, that whatever had happened on Highway 17 was behind him. By 8 o'clock, Thorne was showered again and dressed in clean clothes, sitting at his small kitchen table with his laptop open and his phone beside it. He'd spent the past hour organizing all his evidence, downloading the photos from his phone, pulling up his GPS route data, screenshotting his tachograph readings, writing out a detailed timeline of everything that had happened. The document he'd created was 12 pages long, methodical and precise, leaving nothing out. He included the conversation with the old trucker, the research he'd done on the 1986 accident, the obituaries for Elgin Rousseau and Maida Kincross, and the missing person report for Paul Gagnon. It read like a case file, like something a detective might compile, and Thorne hoped that the sheer weight of documentation would lend credibility to a story that otherwise sounded unhinged. At 9:30, he drove to the Ontario Provincial Police Detachment on Balmoral Street, carrying a USB drive with all his files and a printed copy of his report in a manila folder. The officer at the front desk was a young woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she looked up from her computer with a professional smile as Thorne approached. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Thorne set the folder on the counter between them, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "I need to report something that happened on Highway 17. It's complicated." The officer's expression shifted to something more attentive, and she reached for a notepad. "Were you involved in an accident? Are you injured?" Thorne shook his head. "No accident, but I encountered something on the highway 2 nights ago that I think you should know about. There's a road out there, an old, decommissioned route, and it's still accessible. Drivers could get lost on it, could end up in serious trouble." He pushed the folder across the counter. "I've documented everything here, photos, GPS data, all of it." The officer opened the folder and began leafing through the pages, her expression growing more puzzled as she read. She paused at one of the photos showing the broken pavement and faded yellow line, then looked back up at Thorne. "This road you found, where exactly is it located?" Thorne pulled out his phone and showed her the GPS map with his route highlighted. "It branches off Highway 17 at kilometer marker 487, about halfway between Nipigon and Wawa. It's not visible from the road, you have to know it's there. But there were detour signs directing traffic onto it during the storm 2 nights ago." The officer studied the map, zooming in and out, her frown deepening. "Sir, I'm showing Highway 17 as a straight run through that area. There's no junction at marker 487, no secondary roads." Thorne had expected this response, but it still frustrated him. "That's because it's decommissioned. It shows up in my GPS data as Route 17A, abandoned in 1987. But it's still there, still passable. And during that storm there were signs directing eastbound traffic onto it." The officer set down his phone and closed the folder, and Thorne could see the shift in her demeanor, from professional attention to polite skepticism. "Mr. Merriweather, I understand you had a difficult drive during the storm. Visibility was extremely poor that night, and several drivers reported disorientation. It's possible you took a wrong turn onto a logging road or a maintenance access route and got temporarily confused about your location." Thorne felt his jaw tighten. "I'm not confused. I'm an experienced driver. I know Highway 17 like the back of my hand. And what I'm telling you is that there's something wrong with that stretch of road. People have gone missing there. Paul Gagnon in 1986, and probably others since then. If you look into the records..." The officer held up a hand, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Sir, I appreciate you coming in, and I'll make sure this report is filed. But without evidence of an actual crime or immediate danger, there's not much we can do. If you're concerned about road safety, you should contact the Ministry of Transportation. They handle highway maintenance and signage." She pulled a business card from a holder on the desk and handed it to Thorne. "That's their regional office number. They'll be able to address your concerns about decommissioned roads and improper signage. Thorne took the card, knowing this was as far as he was going to get with the police. What about the missing driver, Paul Gagnon? Can you at least check your records to confirm he disappeared in 1986? The officer's expression softened slightly. I can look into historical records, but that would have been before my time, and probably before digital records. If there was a missing person case from 1986, it would be in archived files. She wrote something on her notepad and tore off the sheet, handing it to Thorne. That's a case number for your report. If we find anything relevant, we'll contact you. But I have to be honest. If this person went missing nearly 40 years ago, the chances of new information surfacing are extremely slim. Thorne thanked her and left the detachment, feeling deflated and frustrated. He'd known it was a long shot, but some part of him had hoped for validation, for someone in authority to take his experience seriously and maybe even investigate. Instead, he'd been politely dismissed as a confused driver who'd gotten turned around in a storm. The business card for the Ministry of Transportation felt heavy in his pocket, and Thorne debated whether it was worth making that call. What would he tell them? That their decommissioned road was still routing traffic during storms? That ghost dispatchers were broadcasting on CB frequencies? They'd dismiss him even faster than the police had. Thorne drove back to his apartment and spent the rest of the morning searching online for any mention of Route 17A or unusual incidents on Highway 17 near marker 487. He found plenty of accident reports, weather advisories, and trucker forum discussions about difficult driving conditions, but nothing that specifically referenced the ghost road or matched his experience. There were a few vague posts about weird vibes on that stretch of highway, and one trucker who claimed his GPS had glitched out near Wawa, but nothing concrete enough to corroborate what Thorne had experienced. He tried searching for Paul Gagnon's name along with terms like missing trucker and Highway 17, but the results were frustratingly sparse. There was a single brief mention in a Thunder Bay newspaper archive from March 1987, noting that the search for missing driver Paul Gagnon had been suspended due to lack of leads. The article mentioned his abandoned truck being found north of the highway, but provided no details about the circumstances or the location. Around noon, Thorne's phone rang with a call from his dispatcher. He answered with a sense of dread, expecting more questions about his GPS blackout and impossible travel times. Instead, the dispatcher's voice was businesslike and focused on logistics. "Merriweather, I've got a load for you if you're available. Pick up in Thunder Bay tomorrow morning, delivery to Sault Ste. Marie by Friday evening. Standard run, should be straightforward." Thorne hesitated, his mind immediately going to the route. Thunder Bay to Sault Ste. Marie meant Highway 17, meant driving past marker 487 again, meant potentially encountering whatever had happened to him 2 nights ago. "What's the weather forecast looking like?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The dispatcher clicked something on his end. "Clear skies, no precipitation expected. Perfect conditions. You interested, or should I offer it to someone else?" Thorne thought about saying no, about turning down the job and maybe taking a few weeks off to let his nerves settle. But he also thought about his bills, his mortgage on the truck, the reality that he couldn't afford to be selective about loads right now. "I'll take it," he heard himself say, and immediately regretted it. "Good," the dispatcher replied. "Pickup is at 0700 at the lumber yard on Walsh Street. Load's already staged, just need to get it hooked up and secured. Should have you out of there by 8 at the latest." After the call ended, Thorne sat staring at his phone, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake. The rational part of his mind said that lightning didn't strike twice, that the conditions 2 nights ago had been unique and unlikely to repeat. But the part of him that had driven that ghost road, that had heard those phantom voices and seen Maida Kincross standing in the snow, knew that some things operated outside the boundaries of probability and reason. He spent the afternoon trying to distract himself, running errands, doing laundry, watching mindless television, but his thoughts kept returning to Highway 17 and what might be waiting for him there. That evening, he forced himself to eat a proper meal and went to bed early, hoping to bank as much rest as possible before the morning run. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by the same looping dreams of endless roads and counting down markers. At some point in the deep hours of night, Thorne woke to the sound of his CB radio crackling with static. He sat up in bed, confused and disoriented before realizing that his CB radio was in his truck, locked up at the storage yard 2 kilometers away. There was no way he could be hearing it from his apartment. He lay back down, telling himself it had been part of the dream, just his overstressed mind playing tricks. But the sound persisted, faint but unmistakable, and when Thorne turned on his bedside lamp and looked around the room, he saw his phone screen glowing on the nightstand. He picked it up and found his trucking company's fleet tracking app had opened itself somehow, showing a map view. His truck's icon was blinking at the storage yard, but there was a thin gray line extending from it, reaching north across the map toward Highway 17. As Thorne watched, the line grew longer, tracing a path that curved and twisted like something alive, heading toward that stretch of road between Nipigon and Wawa. Thorne closed the app forcefully and set his phone face down on the nightstand, his heart racing. When he picked it up again a few seconds later to make sure it was truly closed, the app was still shut down, showing only his home screen. He told himself it had been a glitch, maybe some background process updating his previous route data. But the image of that gray line extending from his truck, reaching toward the ghost road like a hook seeking a fish, stayed with him. He didn't sleep again that night, just lay in bed watching the numbers on his alarm clock count down toward 6 a.m. when he'd need to get up and start preparing for the run. Part of him considered calling his dispatcher at dawn and canceling, claiming illness or mechanical problems, or anything that would get him out of driving Highway 17 today. But Thorne had never been a quitter, had never backed down from a challenge, and the idea of letting fear dictate his decisions felt like a personal failure he couldn't accept. At 6:30, he was showered, dressed, and walking out to his car with a travel mug of coffee in hand. The morning was clear and cold, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east, and Thunder Bay looked exactly as it always did. Ordinary, predictable, safe. Thorne drove to the storage yard and found his truck exactly where he'd left it. No signs of tampering or disturbance. He did his pre-trip inspection with extra care, checking every light, every tire, every connection, looking for anything out of place. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. But as he climbed into the cab and started the engine, Thorne noticed something that made his stomach drop. His CB radio was on, the channel indicator showing that it was tuned to frequency 19, the standard trucker channel. Thorne always turned his CB off when he parked for the night, a habit so ingrained that he didn't even think about it anymore. But here it was, powered on and waiting. He told himself he must have forgotten in his exhaustion 2 nights ago that it wasn't significant. But he didn't believe it. The drive to the lumber yard was uneventful, and the loading process went smoothly. Thorne watched the forklift operators stack fresh-cut lumber onto his flatbed trailer, securing the load with chains and straps, and tried to focus on the familiar routine. By 8:15, he was pulling out of the yard and heading toward Highway 17, the sun now fully above the horizon, and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Traffic was light this early, mostly other commercial vehicles and a few commuters heading into the city for work. Thorne merged onto the Trans-Canada and settled into the right lane, keeping his speed moderate and his eyes on the road ahead. For the first 100 kilometers, nothing unusual happened. The highway unfurled exactly as it should, with markers counting up in regular sequence and towns appearing at their expected intervals. Thorne's CB picked up occasional chatter from other drivers, mundane conversations about weather and traffic and where to find the best coffee along the route. He began to relax slightly, allowing himself to think that maybe this run would be different, that maybe the ghost road only appeared during storms. But as he approached kilometer marker 450, Thorne's CB radio suddenly erupted with static. He reached over to adjust the squelch, but before he could touch it, a voice broke through. The dispatcher's voice. Elgin Rousseau's voice. Just as clear as it had been 2 nights ago. All units, be advised that Highway 17 eastbound is experiencing adverse conditions between markers 460 and 490. Reduced visibility due to ground fog. Recommend reduced speed and increased following distance. Thorne's hands tightened on the wheel. There was no fog. The sky was crystal clear. Visibility was unlimited, and the highway department's electronic signs had shown no warnings or advisories when he'd passed them. He keyed his CB mic, his voice tight. "This is Merriweather eastbound at marker 452. I'm not seeing any fog conditions. Can you clarify the advisory?" The static intensified for a moment, and when Elgin Rousseau's voice came back, there was something different about it. A quality of awareness that hadn't been there before. "Merriweather, we've been trying to reach you. You need to turn back. The road ahead is closed." Thorne's mouth went dry. He looked in his mirrors, checking to see if other traffic was slowing or stopping, but the highway behind him was empty. "Closed for what reason?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Accident at marker 462, the dispatcher replied. "Multiple vehicles involved, hazardous materials spill. All eastbound traffic is being diverted. Follow detour signage when it appears." Thorne stared at the road ahead, his mind racing. Marker 462 didn't exist anymore. The accident that had happened there was 37 years in the past. But if the ghost road was active right now, in broad daylight under clear skies, then the rules he thought he understood were meaningless. He could see marker 460 approaching, and beyond it, the stretch of highway where he'd found the hidden turnoff yesterday. His foot eased off the accelerator instinctively, bringing his truck down to 60 kilometers per hour, then 50. Part of him wanted to ignore the voice, to keep driving straight through and prove that nothing supernatural could touch him in daylight. But a stronger part remembered the fear in Paul Gagnon's voice, remembered the empty maintenance truck and the figure of Maida Kincross standing in the snow. At marker 470, Thorne made a decision. He pulled onto the shoulder, set his parking brake, and turned off his engine. If the ghost road wanted him, it would have to work harder than this. He wasn't going to willingly drive into whatever trap it was setting. The CB crackled again, and this time a different voice came through, younger, familiar, desperate. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've been driving for hours and I can't find my way back to the highway. My fuel is almost gone. Please, I need help." Thorne grabbed his handset so hard his knuckles went white. "Paul, this is Merriweather. I can hear you. Where are you right now?" There was a pause, filled with the sound of wind and static. "I don't know. I'm on some kind of old road, all curves. Can't see more than 20 feet ahead. Trees on both sides, snow everywhere. I thought I was following a detour, but nothing looks right anymore." Thorne closed his eyes, trying to think. "Paul, listen to me carefully. You need to stop driving right now. Set your brakes and stay in your cab." "I can't stop." Paul's voice was rising toward panic. "Something's following me. I can see headlights in my mirrors, getting closer. If I stop, they'll catch me." Thorne felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, catch you? Who's following you?" But instead of Paul's voice, Elgin Rousseau's dispatcher tone cut back in. Unit 12, maintain your current speed and direction. You're approaching a safe egress point at marker 462. Do not deviate from the route. Thorne's eyes snapped open. No. Paul, don't listen to him. There is no marker 462. There is no safe egress. He's leading you deeper in. Static filled the channel for several long seconds, and when Paul's voice returned, it was quieter, resigned. I'm sorry, I don't know who to believe anymore. I just want to go home. The transmission cut off, and despite Thorne's repeated attempts to raise Paul on the CB, there was no response. Just the soft hiss of empty air and the occasional burst of atmospheric interference. Thorne sat in his parked truck, staring at the highway ahead and the stretch of road that might or might not contain a portal to something that shouldn't exist. His rational mind told him to start his engine, continue his delivery, and forget about phantom voices from dead men. But his conscience wouldn't let him abandon Paul Gagnon, even if Paul had been dead for 37 years. Even if every attempt to help only drew Thorne deeper into a mystery that had already consumed too many lives. He thought about the old trucker's warning, stay off that road, and he thought about his own experience 2 nights ago, how he'd followed the detour and emerged with missing time and impossible distances. What if he could do it again, but this time with intention? What if he could find Paul on that ghost road and guide him out somehow? The idea was insane, reckless, probably suicidal. But it was also the only thing Thorne could think of that might make a difference. He reached for his phone and opened a voice memo app, then pressed record. My name is Thorne Merriweather. Today is Wednesday, November 13th, 2025, and I'm parked on Highway 17 at kilometer marker 470. I'm about to do something that probably makes no sense, but I need to document it in case I don't come back the way I'm supposed to. He paused, gathering his thoughts. 2 nights ago, I encountered what I believe is a temporal loop, or some kind of geographic anomaly on this highway. A decommissioned road called Route 17A that still exists in some form, trapping the echoes of people who died in a 1986 accident. I've heard their voices on my CB, I've seen physical evidence of their presence, and I can't explain it with any rational framework. But I also can't ignore it. Thorne took a breath. If something happens to me, if my truck is found abandoned, or if I disappear, I need people to know that I've made this choice voluntarily. I'm going to attempt to drive Route 17A again, to find a driver named Paul Gagnon who went missing in 1986, and to see if there's any way to break the loop or help him escape. I don't know if it's possible. I don't even know if it makes sense. But I have to try. He ended the recording and emailed the file to himself, to his dispatcher, and to the OPP detective whose business card he still had. Then he started his engine and pulled back onto the highway, heading east toward marker 487 and whatever waited there. As he approached the spot where he'd found the hidden road, Thorne's CB came alive with multiple voices overlapping. Elgin Rousseau giving coordinates, Paul Gagnon calling for help. Other voices Thorne didn't recognize, all speaking at once, in a cacophony of distress and confusion. He slowed his truck to a crawl, scanning the shoulder for the orange detour signs he'd seen 2 nights ago. And there they were, appearing as if they'd been there all along. Big, reflective arrows pointing right into the trees, with text that read, "Temporary detour. Follow signs." Thorne's hands were shaking as he turned his wheel, feeling his truck leave the pavement of Highway 17 and crunch over the snowbank onto the broken asphalt of Route 17A. The transition was just as jarring as it had been before, from smooth highway to rough, uncertain surface, from open sky to shadowed corridor of trees. His headlights seemed dimmer here, as if the light itself was being absorbed by the forest, and the temperature inside his cab dropped noticeably despite the heater running at full blast. The road curved ahead into darkness that shouldn't exist in late morning, and Thorne followed it with his footlight on the accelerator, every sense on high alert. His odometer was climbing, his tachograph recording distance and time, but Thorne had no faith that either measurement would mean anything if he emerged. The CB continued to crackle with voices, and Thorne tried repeatedly to raise Paul, to establish clear communication, but the responses he got were fragmented and unclear. He drove for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, past trees that all looked identical, over frost heaves and potholes that appeared without warning. His GPS showed no position data, just a blank screen with a loading icon. His phone had no signal. He was completely isolated, suspended in a space that existed between one moment and the next, 1 mile and the next, with no guarantee that the rules he'd relied on his entire life still applied. And then, ahead in the murk and shadow, Thorne saw something that made him hit his brakes. A truck parked at the side of the road with its 4 ways blinking weakly. The design was old, maybe 1980s vintage, with a squared-off cab and faded paint that might have once been blue. Thorne pulled up behind it and set his own parking brake, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed a flashlight from his door pocket and climbed out into air so cold it burned his lungs. The silence was absolute. No wind, no bird calls, no sound of his own truck's engine even though he'd left it running. Thorne approached the parked truck cautiously, playing his flashlight beam over its exterior. The license plate was dated 1986, and the name painted on the door read Northern Ontario Transport Services. Thorne's breath caught. This was Paul Gagnon's truck. This was where he'd stopped, where he'd run out of fuel or hope or both, and where he'd somehow ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Thorne moved to the driver's side and shined his light through the window. The cab was empty, but there were signs of recent occupation. A coffee thermos on the dash, a logbook open on the passenger seat, a jacket draped over the steering wheel. Thorne tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He climbed up into the cab, moving carefully, feeling like he was disturbing a shrine or a crime scene. The logbook was filled with entries in neat handwriting, the last one dated November 22nd, 1986. 22:30 hours, following detour around accident scene, visibility 0, fuel at quarter tank, will update at next marker. There were no further entries after that line, just blank pages waiting for updates that never came. Thorne picked up the jacket and found a wallet in the inside pocket. He opened it and saw a driver's license with a photo of a young man, maybe 25 years old, with dark hair and an uncertain smile. Paul Gagnon, the license read. Date of birth, April 3rd, 1961. Thorne stood in that silent cab holding the wallet of a man who'd been missing for 37 years, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. He'd been right. The ghost road was real. The loop was real. And Paul Gagnon had been trapped here for longer than Thorne had been alive. But where was Paul now? If his truck was here, empty and abandoned, where had the man himself gone? Thorne climbed back down and walked around the vehicle, shining his flashlight on the ground. There were footprints in the snow, old ones that looked like they'd been there for decades, leading away from the truck and deeper into the forest. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Thorne followed them. The prints led about 50 feet into the trees before stopping at a spot where the snow was disturbed and churned up, as if someone had paced back and forth there for a long time. And beyond that spot, nothing. No continuing prints, no sign of where Paul had gone next. Just virgin snow and silent trees. Thorne stood in that clearing, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and realized with sinking certainty that he couldn't save Paul Gagnon. No one could. Whatever had happened to him was beyond rescue, beyond help. beyond any normal concept of death or disappearance. Paul existed now only as an echo, a voice on a CB radio calling out to other drivers who might make the same wrong turn. Thorne walked back to his own truck, climbed into the cab and sat with his hands on the wheel, trying to decide what to do next. He could continue forward, could see where this road led, could maybe find Maida Kincross and Elgin Rousseau and all the others who were caught in this loop. Or he could try to turn around, to retrace his path back to Highway 17 and normal reality. The CB crackled one final time, and Paul's voice came through, clearer than before. Whoever you are, thank you for trying. But you need to leave now. This place doesn't let go easily, and the longer you stay, the harder it gets to find your way out. Go. Please. Thorne grabbed his mic. Paul, I found your truck. I found your wallet. I'll make sure your family knows. But static swallowed the rest of his words. And when it cleared, the channel was dead silent. Thorne put his truck in reverse and began backing up, using his mirrors to follow the road in the direction he'd come. The backing continued for longer than seemed possible. 5 minutes, 10, 15, and his rear tires never seemed to reach the point where he'd turned off Highway 17. Panic started to creep in. The realization that maybe Paul was right. Maybe the road didn't want to let him leave. Thorne stopped backing up and pulled forward again, this time driving faster, following the curves with reckless abandon, not caring anymore about the condition of the road or the darkness or anything except getting out. And then, without warning or transition, he was back. Highway 17 stretched ahead in full daylight, real and solid and blessedly normal. Thorne's GPS flickered to life, showing his position at kilometer marker 520, 33 kilometers past where he'd turned onto Route 17A. His phone suddenly had the signal again, messages and notifications flooding in all at once. And his dashboard clock showed 3:47 p.m. Nearly 6 hours had passed since he'd pulled onto the shoulder at marker 470. Thorne pulled into the first rest stop he could find and just sat there, shaking and trying to process what had happened. His tachograph showed him driving continuously for the past 6 hours, covering the distance from marker 470 to 520 multiple times over, his route traced as impossible loops and switchbacks. His fuel gauge had dropped by over a quarter tank despite the relatively short distance covered on the highway, and when he checked his mirrors, he saw gray road dust covering his trailer and cab, dust that shouldn't be there after driving on modern paved highway. Thorne grabbed his phone and opened the voice memo app, hitting record with trembling fingers. Addendum to my previous recording. I drove Route 17A again. I found Paul Gagnon's truck, empty, abandoned. Found his wallet, his logbook, his last entry from 1986. I couldn't save him. I couldn't help him. He told me to leave, and I did, but I don't know if I actually got out or if I'm still in there somehow. I don't know what's real anymore. The road took 6 hours of my time, a quarter tank of fuel, and I have nothing to show for it except more questions. He ended the recording and sat in silence, listening to the normal sounds of the rest stop, cars coming and going, families talking, the distant beep of a truck backing up. All of it felt surreal, like a movie playing on a screen rather than actual reality. Thorne eventually started his engine and continued to Sault Ste. Marie, completed his delivery, and drove back to Thunder Bay in a state of numb autopilot. When he finally made it home 3 days later, he found an email from the OPP detective he'd sent his voice memos to. The message was brief and professionally polite. Mr. Merriweather, thank you for your report. After reviewing your documentation and the information provided, we have no evidence of criminal activity or public safety concerns that would warrant further investigation. The route anomaly you described appears to be related to GPS mapping errors. We recommend you report these technical issues to your fleet management company. Case closed. No mention of Paul Gagnon, no acknowledgement of the historical accident, no recognition that Thorne had documented something genuinely inexplicable. Thorne never took another load that required him to drive Highway 17 between Nipigon and Wawa. He requested route changes, accepted longer trips that went around the area, and when asked why, he simply said he preferred other routes. His company noted it in his file, but didn't push the issue. Other drivers continued to haul that stretch of highway without incident, and life went on as it always had. But sometimes, late at night when Thorne couldn't sleep, he'd turn on his old CB radio at home and scan through channels, listening for voices that shouldn't exist. And once, about 3 months after his experience on Route 17A, he heard it. Elgin Rousseau calling out coordinates, Paul Gagnon responding in panic, the whole sequence playing out exactly as it had before. Thorne listened until the transmission ended, then turned off his radio and sat in the dark, knowing that somewhere out there in the endless snow and shadow, the loop continued. The dead kept directing traffic, the lost kept driving, and Highway 17 kept its secrets buried under broken asphalt and historical markers that no longer existed. And Thorne carried his own secret too, the knowledge that some roads don't just take you from one place to another. They take you outside of place entirely, into spaces between moments where time runs backward and forward simultaneously, where the past never quite stays buried, and where drivers who make one wrong turn might never find their way home. Years later, when Thorne finally retired from trucking, he wrote everything down in a private journal that he kept in a locked drawer. He titled it The Ghost Road, A True Account, and included every detail he could remember, every piece of evidence he'd collected, every voice he'd heard on those dark broadcasts. He never published it, never showed it to anyone, but he kept it as insurance against forgetting, against convincing himself that it had all been stress or hallucination or some elaborate malfunction of his equipment and mind. Because Thorne knew, with the certainty that comes from lived experience rather than belief, that Route 17A was still out there, still waiting in the margins of Highway 17 for the right conditions and the wrong driver. And he knew that Paul Gagnon and all the others who'd been swallowed by that road were still trapped in their endless loop, still calling for help that would never come, still driving toward a destination that didn't exist. And sometimes, on nights when the snow fell heavy and the wind howled across northern Ontario, Thorne would wake from dreams of endless curves and counting down markers, and he'd check his phone to make sure his GPS wasn't showing gray lines reaching out toward that haunted stretch of highway. Most nights it didn't, but some nights it did, and on those nights Thorne wouldn't sleep again until sunrise, keeping watch against a road that refused to stay buried. Cormac Vale had been driving across the Saskatchewan prairies for 6 straight hours when his fuel warning light blinked on, a small orange icon that felt like an accusation in the gathering dusk. He'd meant to stop in Swift Current, had even pulled off the Trans-Canada with that intention, but the lineup at the truck stop had been 12 deep, and Cormac had made the calculation that he could push through to the next major center without issue. That calculation had been wrong. Now he was somewhere south of Highway 1 on a grid road that his GPS insisted would save him 40 minutes, watching his fuel gauge dip below the quarter tank mark while the sun bled out across an endless horizon of harvested wheat fields. The prairie stretched in all directions like an ocean frozen mid-wave, all gentle swells and distant grain elevators that looked like ships anchored against the coming night. It was beautiful in a desolate way, but beauty didn't help when you were running on fumes with no gas station in sight. Cormac had been hauling freight across Western Canada for nearly 15 years, and he knew better than to trust shortcuts on grid roads. especially this late in the season. November in Saskatchewan meant early darkness, unpredictable weather, and small towns that rolled up their sidewalks at 5 p.m. But his dispatcher had been pushing him hard on this run, emphasizing the delivery deadline in Regina and the penalty fees they'd face if he missed the window, and Cormac had let that pressure override his better judgment. Now he was paying for it. Watching kilometer markers tick by with agonizing slowness, while his fuel gauge continued its steady descent toward empty. His phone showed 2 bars of signal, enough to pull up a map, and he zoomed in on his current location looking for anything that might have fuel. The screen showed a spiderweb of grid roads, a handful of abandoned railway lines, and one small town about 15 kilometers ahead. No name on the map, just a gray dot indicating human habitation. Cormac tapped on it hopefully, but the information pop-up was sparse. Population, unincorporated. Services, unknown. It wasn't promising, but it was better than nothing. Cormac guided his rig south on the dirt grid road, the setting sun casting his shadow long across the stubble fields to his left. The road's surface was rough but passable, graded recently enough that the washboard hadn't gotten too severe, and his truck handled it well despite the 40-foot trailer he was pulling. The load was light, agricultural equipment parts heading to a dealership in Regina, so at least he didn't have to worry about bogging down if the road got soft. What concerned him more was the absolute emptiness of the landscape. In the past hour, he hadn't seen another vehicle, hadn't passed a farmhouse with lights on, hadn't even spotted cattle in the fields. Just endless stubble and sky. The two meeting at a horizon so flat and distant it seemed to curve with the earth itself. It was the kind of emptiness that made you understand why early settlers had gone mad out here, why some of them had written letters home describing the prairie as a vast nothing that swallowed sound and hope in equal measure. As full darkness settled in, Cormac's headlights became the only illumination for miles in any direction. The stars were coming out overhead, so many of them that the sky looked crowded, but they provided no useful light for navigation. His fuel gauge had dropped to the red zone now, maybe 30 kilometers of range left if he was lucky, and Cormac found himself unconsciously easing off the throttle to conserve every drop. The town should be close now, according to his odometer, and he strained his eyes looking for any sign of lights or structures ahead. For a long moment there was nothing, just the tunnel of his headlights cutting through darkness and the rhythmic bounce of his cab over the uneven road. Then, at the very limit of his vision, Cormac saw it, the silhouette of a grain elevator rising against the stars like a cathedral in the wilderness. The sight brought a surge of relief so intense it was almost physical. Where there was a grain elevator, there was usually a town, and where there was a town, there was usually fuel. Or at least there had been, once upon a time. As Cormac drew closer, his relief began to curdle into uncertainty. The grain elevator was definitely there. A massive wooden structure that must have been 40 or 50 feet tall. But there were no lights around it. No street lamps, no illuminated signs, no glow of windows from nearby buildings. The elevator itself looked dark and abandoned, its paint peeling away in long strips that fluttered in the wind like dead skin. Cormac downshifted as he reached what must have been the town's main street. A dirt road slightly wider than the grid road he'd been following, with buildings lined up on either side like rotting teeth. His headlights swept across storefronts with broken windows, a church with its steeple listing to one side, houses with sagging porches and doors that hung open on broken hinges. The place looked like it had been dead for decades, one of those prairie ghost towns that had died when the railway stopped running, or the highway bypassed them, or the young people all moved away to cities that offered something more than dust and wind and endless sky. Cormac slowed his truck to a crawl, scanning both sides of the street for any sign of a gas station or even just a fuel pump attached to a store. His headlights illuminated a faded sign hanging from a post. "Welcome to," but the town's name had weathered away, leaving just the mounting brackets and a few flakes of paint. He continued down the main street, past what might have once been a general store, a post office, a cafe with tables still visible through the grimy windows. Everything was closed. Everything was dark, and Cormac was beginning to accept that he'd gambled wrong. This town was too far gone to offer anything useful, and he'd wasted precious fuel driving here. He was calculating whether he had enough diesel left to make it back to the Trans-Canada when his headlights caught something that made him hit his brakes. There was a light on in one of the houses, a warm yellow glow spilling out through intact windows onto a porch that looked recently swept. Smoke was rising from the chimney, visible as a darker column against the night sky, and there was a pickup truck parked in the driveway that looked like it had been driven recently. No rust, no flat tires, no signs of abandonment. Cormac sat in his idling truck, staring at that lit window and trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him that something was wrong about this situation, that a single occupied house in a town full of ruins was a detail that didn't fit any normal pattern. But his fuel gauge was telling him an even more urgent story, and the reality was that he needed help whether he liked it or not. He couldn't make it back to the highway, couldn't push forward to the next town, and sitting here until his tank ran dry would leave him stranded in the middle of nowhere with no easy way to get help. At least, if there were people in that house, they might have a phone that worked, might be able to point him toward the nearest fuel source, might even have a few jerry cans of diesel they'd be willing to sell. Cormac pulled his truck over to the side of the street, as close to the lit house as he could get without blocking the road, and killed his engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through empty buildings. He grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket and climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on gravel that sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be for early November, and Cormac could see his breath forming clouds as he walked toward the lit house. As he got closer, he could make out more details. The house was a simple two-story structure with white siding that had been maintained recently enough to still look white rather than gray. The porch had a rocking chair on it, and there were curtains in the windows, real curtains, not the ragged strips of fabric that hung in the abandoned buildings around it. Someone definitely lived here, and they'd been maintaining the property despite the decay surrounding them. Cormac climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before putting his full weight on it, and knocked on the front door 3 times. The sound echoed in the stillness, and for a moment nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps inside, heavy and slow, approaching the door with the deliberate pace of someone who wasn't in a hurry and wasn't particularly surprised to have visitors. The door opened, and Cormac found himself looking at a woman who might have been anywhere between 50 and 70 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and eyes that assessed him with the kind of calm wariness that came from living in isolated places. "Evening," Cormac said, trying to sound friendly but not desperate. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm having a fuel situation with my truck. I was hoping you might know where the nearest gas station is, or if there's anywhere in town I could buy some diesel." The woman studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Cormac noticed that she was wearing clothes that looked oddly old-fashioned. A wool dress with a high collar, thick stockings, practical shoes that might have been modern 50 years ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and measured, with the flat vowels of prairie English. "Nearest fuel is in Assiniboia, 40 kilometers north. Nothing between here and there." Cormac's heart sank. 40 kilometers might as well be 400 with the fuel he had left. "Is there any chance you might have some diesel here? I can pay whatever's fair. I just need enough to make it to Assiniboia." The woman's gaze shifted past him to where his truck sat idling in the street, its running lights glowing in the darkness. Something flickered across her face, Concern, maybe, or recognition of a problem she'd seen before. "Wait here," she said finally, and closed the door before Cormac could respond. He stood on the porch, listening to her footsteps recede into the house and wondering if she was coming back or if she'd decided he wasn't worth helping. The wind picked up, rattling loose siding on the abandoned building across the street and carrying with it the smell of dust and grain chaff and something else Cormac couldn't quite identify. Something organic and slightly rotten, like vegetables left too long in a cellar. He turned his flashlight beam on the house next door and saw that the windows were broken out. The interior visible as a dark cavity full of furniture that had been picked over by weather and animals. It was like standing at the edge of two different worlds. Behind him, a warm, lit house with smoke rising from its chimney, and in front of him, the hollow corpse of a town that had given up decades ago. The contrast was so stark it felt staged, like a movie set designed to unsettle viewers by putting the normal next to the nightmare. The door opened again, and the woman reappeared, this time wearing a heavy coat and carrying a flashlight of her own. "I don't have diesel here," she said, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind her. "But there's a fuel pump at the old co-op building, about 2 blocks down. Still has diesel in the underground tank, but it's been there a while. Might work, might not." Cormac felt a flicker of hope. "The pump still works?" The woman nodded, already moving down the porch steps. "It's not electric, it's a hand-crank model from before they modernized. Never got removed when the co-op closed. Follow me, I'll show you." She walked down the street without waiting to see if Cormac followed, her flashlight beam bouncing off abandoned storefronts and creating shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Cormac hurried to catch up, his own flashlight cutting parallel tracks through the darkness. "Do you mind if I ask," he said as they walked, "why you're still here? I mean, it looks like everyone else left a long time ago." The woman was quiet for several steps, and Cormac thought maybe she wasn't going to answer. Then she spoke without turning around, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "This is my home. My family built that house in 1947, raised 3 generations there. Just because everyone else left doesn't mean I have to." There was a finality to her tone that discouraged further questions, and Cormac let the subject drop. They walked in silence past more ruins. A bank with its vault door standing open like a mouth, a barber shop with its striped pole lying in the street, a hardware store where tools still hung on display hooks inside the broken windows. The woman's flashlight beam swept across each building methodically, as if she was performing a nightly inspection, checking to make sure everything was still dead and staying that way. After 2 blocks, she stopped in front of a large wooden structure that might have been impressive once, but now leaned slightly to the left. Its loading dock collapsed and its walls covered in graffiti, so old it had weathered to the same gray as the wood beneath. "This is it," the woman said, pointing her flashlight at a metal box mounted on the side of the building. "Pump's in there. Tank access is around back." Cormac approached the metal box and found a rusted padlock holding it shut. He tugged on it experimentally, but the lock held firm despite its appearance. "You have a key for this?" he asked, turning back toward the woman. She was already holding up a key ring with several old brass keys dangling from it, and she stepped forward to unlock the padlock with practiced ease. The box door swung open with a metallic shriek, revealing a pump mechanism that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was all cast iron and brass fittings, with a hand-crank handle on one side and a mechanical counter that would tick off gallons as they passed through. A coil of old rubber hose was hanging on a hook inside the box, cracked and stiff with age, and Cormac had serious doubts about whether any of this equipment was still functional. But he'd come this far, and the alternative was sitting in his truck until someone happened by, which, given the emptiness of this town and the surrounding area, might be days. "Thank you," Cormac said, meaning it. I really appreciate this. How much do I owe you?" The woman waved off the question with one hand. "Tank belongs to the co-op, not me. Far as I'm concerned, anything left in there is abandoned property. Take what you need." She handed him the keys. "When you're done, lock it back up and leave the keys on my porch. I'm going back to the house. It's cold out." Before Cormac could ask anything else, she turned and walked back the way they'd come, her flashlight beam growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around a corner, leaving him alone in the darkness with a hand-crank fuel pump and a tank full of diesel that might be as old as he was. Cormac took a deep breath and went to work, first walking around to the back of the building to find the tank access. It was a metal cap set into concrete, and when he unscrewed it and shined his flashlight down into the opening, he could see liquid reflecting back at him about 8 feet down. The smell of diesel was strong and relatively fresh, which was encouraging. Old diesel could gel or separate, becoming useless sludge, but this smelled like it might still be viable. He went back to his truck and positioned it as close to the pump as the hose length would allow, then spent 20 minutes figuring out how to prime the hand crank mechanism and get fuel flowing. The pump was stubborn, its internal seals dried out and resistant, but eventually Cormac heard the satisfying gurgle of diesel moving through pipes and into the hose. He filled his truck's tank slowly, working the hand crank in a steady rhythm while the mechanical counter ticked off gallons with clockwork precision. 20 gallons, 30, 40, enough to get him to Regina and back to civilization. As he worked, Cormac became aware of sounds in the darkness around him. Not threatening sounds exactly, but present ones. The creak of wood settling in cooling night air, the rattle of loose tin in the wind, and underneath it all a kind of low hum that might have been power lines or distant machinery or just the acoustic tricks that empty spaces played on human ears. He tried to ignore it and focus on the task at hand, but the longer he stood there cranking fuel from an abandoned tank in a dead town, the more wrong everything felt. When his tank was full, Cormac secured the pump hose and locked the metal box, slipping the keys into his jacket pocket to return to the woman's porch as promised. He climbed back into his cab and started the engine, feeling a surge of relief at the familiar diesel rumble. The fuel gauge needle climbed steadily toward full, and Cormac allowed himself to relax slightly. He'd gotten lucky, found exactly what he needed in the most unlikely place imaginable. Now, all he had to do was drive back to the grid road, navigate his way to the Trans-Canada, and put this strange detour behind him. He put the truck in gear and began the slow process of turning around on the narrow main street, using the width of abandoned properties to maneuver his trailer. As his headlights swept across buildings during the turn, Cormac caught movement in one of the upper windows of the general store. A flicker of something pale and quick, there and gone so fast he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But when he completed his turn and started driving back toward the woman's house to return her keys, he saw it again. This time in the doorway of the church. A figure, tall and thin, watching his truck pass. No features visible, just a silhouette darker than the shadows around it. Cormac's hands tightened on the steering wheel and he pressed slightly harder on the accelerator, eager now to complete his business and leave this town behind. He pulled up in front of the lit house and killed his engine, intending to make this quick, just drop the keys on the porch and go. But as he approached the house, he noticed something that stopped him cold. There were footprints in the dust of the porch. Lots of them. Far more than could be explained by the woman's single trip out to show him the fuel pump. The prints overlapped and crossed each other, some fresh and some older, creating a pattern that suggested multiple people coming and going regularly. But every other house on this street was abandoned, every other building dark and empty. Unless the woman had visitors from outside the town, which seemed unlikely given the isolation, these prints made no sense. Cormac set the keys on the porch railing as instructed and took a step back. his eyes scanning the windows of the house for any movement inside. The curtains were drawn now, where before they'd been open, and the light that spilled through them seemed different somehow, colder, less welcoming. He returned to his truck quickly, not quite running but moving faster than a casual walk, and climbed back into the safety of his cab. The door lock clicked down with a sound that was deeply reassuring, and Cormac started the engine without allowing himself to look back at the house. He drove slowly through the dead town, his headlights illuminating empty buildings and overgrown yards, and with every passing moment he felt a growing conviction that he'd missed something important, that there had been details in the periphery of his awareness that he should have paid closer attention to. The woman's old-fashioned clothes, the single-lit house in a town of ruins, the footprints on the porch that didn't match her story of living alone. All of it pointed towards something that didn't add up. But Cormac couldn't quite put his finger on what bothered him most, couldn't articulate the wrongness that had settled into his bones like cold weather. He reached the edge of town and turned north onto the grid road that would take him back toward the Trans-Canada, and only when the lights of the town had disappeared completely behind him did he allow himself to breathe normally again. His phone, which had shown 2 bars of signal when he'd arrived, now showed none at all. No signal, no data, just the emergency calls only message that meant he was truly isolated out here on the prairie. Cormac tried not to let that bother him. Cell coverage was spotty in rural Saskatchewan, and it was entirely normal to lose signal on grid roads between towns. But combined with everything else he'd experienced, the loss of connectivity felt like another small wrongness added to the growing pile. He drove for 20 minutes, following the grid road north through darkness so complete that his headlights seemed to create reality rather than just illuminate it. The road's surface had deteriorated since he'd driven south earlier, or maybe he was just more aware of the washboard and potholes now that his mind wasn't focused entirely on finding fuel. His trailer bounced and rattled behind him, and Cormac found himself gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, his shoulders bunched with tension. When he finally saw the lights of the Trans-Canada ahead, a string of orange sodium vapor lamps marking the highway's path across the prairie, he felt relief wash over him so intensely that his eyes actually stung with it. He merged onto the highway and immediately felt like he'd crossed a boundary back into the normal world, where things made sense and abandoned towns stayed abandoned, and single-lit houses didn't exist in the middle of ruins. Traffic was light but present, the occasional transport truck heading east or west, a few cars with out-of-province plates, the normal flow of late-night highway commerce. Cormac settled into the right lane and tried to put the experience behind him, focusing on the road ahead and the delivery deadline he still needed to meet in Regina. But even as he drove, putting kilometers between himself and that unnamed town, he couldn't shake the memory of the woman's face as she'd studied him on her porch, or the way those footprints had crisscrossed her porch in patterns that suggested many visitors to a place where no one should have been visiting at all. And he couldn't forget the figure he'd seen in the church doorway, watching his truck pass with an attention that felt predatory despite the distance. Cormac told himself it had been a trick of light and shadow, his mind finding patterns and randomness because that's what human minds did in stressful situations. But he didn't believe it. 40 minutes later, Cormac pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of Regina and topped off his fuel tank with fresh diesel from a proper pump, even though his gauge showed he was still 3/4 full. He didn't trust the fuel from that hand crank pump, didn't want to risk it clogging his filters or causing engine problems down the road. As the new fuel flowed into his tank, washing away and diluting whatever he'd taken from the co-op, Cormac felt like he was performing some kind of cleansing ritual, purging his truck of any connection to that strange place. When the pump clicked off, he went inside to pay and get coffee, and found himself telling the cashier about his detour through the abandoned town. The cashier was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and the tired eyes of someone working the graveyard shift, and he listened to Cormac's story with polite disinterest until Cormac mentioned the woman in the lit house. Then the man's expression changed, became more focused. "You saw someone living there?" he asked. "In one of the ghost towns south of here?" Cormac nodded. "Yeah," older woman, said her family built the house in 1947. She seemed perfectly normal, helped me find fuel. The cashier was quiet for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "That's strange. I've been working this stop for 20 years. Heard stories about most of the abandoned towns in this area. Some of them do have squatters sometimes, drifters passing through, but it's rare for anyone to stay long-term. Too isolated, no services, no reason to be there." He rang up Cormac's purchase and handed back his credit card. "Which town was it? Do you remember the name?" Cormac shrugged. "There was a sign, but the name had weathered off. It was about 40 kilometers south of Assiniboia, right on a grid road." The cashier frowned, thinking. "That's deep prairie. Not much out there anymore. Used to be dozens of little towns along the railway lines, but when the grain companies consolidated and the trains stopped running, most of them just died. People moved to bigger centers, left everything behind." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping as if sharing a confidence. "You know what's weird, though? Some of those old towns, people report strange things. Lights where there shouldn't be lights. Sounds of trains that stopped running decades ago. That kind of thing. Local legend stuff. Probably just bored teenagers or optical illusions, but it makes you wonder." Cormac thanked him and took his coffee out to the parking lot where his truck sat under the harsh fluorescent lights like something real and solid and trustworthy. He climbed back into the cab and pulled out his logbook to record the fuel stop, and that's when he noticed something odd about his previous entry. The time he'd written down for leaving Swift Current was 3:45 p.m., and according to his dashboard clock, it was now 11:30 p.m. Almost 8 hours had passed, but Cormac could only account for about 6.5 of them. Even allowing for the time spent at the abandoned town and the slow drive on grid roads, there was a gap of at least an hour that he couldn't explain. He checked his phone's timeline, the feature that tracked his locations throughout the day, but there was just a blank space where the abandoned town should have been. His location history showed him leaving Swift Current, then nothing until he appeared on the Trans-Canada 40 minutes ago. As if that entire detour through the prairie had happened outside of measurable time and space, leaving no digital footprint to prove it had been real. Cormac stared at his phone screen, his coffee growing cold in his hand, and felt the first cold fingers of real fear beginning to wrap around his chest. Cormac completed his delivery in Regina the next morning, unloading agricultural equipment parts at a dealership on the city's industrial outskirts, while his mind kept returning to the abandoned town and the missing hour in his timeline. The warehouse crew moved efficiently around his truck, checking part numbers against manifests and stacking items on pallets, but Cormac barely registered their presence. He kept pulling out his phone and checking his location history, hoping that maybe the data had updated overnight, that the gap would be filled in with the route he'd actually driven. But the blank space remained, a digital void where his detour should have been recorded. It was as if his phone had simply refused to acknowledge that place existed, had declined to create any record of his passage through it. Cormac had heard about dead zones where cell towers couldn't reach, but he'd never experienced one that completely erased his location data rather than just pausing it. The distinction felt significant, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. After the delivery paperwork was signed and his trailer was empty, Cormac drove to a truck stop on the Trans-Canada and parked in a spot where he could see the highway stretching away in both directions. He needed to make a decision about his return route, and the choice felt heavier than it should have. His dispatcher had already sent him the details for his next load, a pickup in swift current that needed to be in Winnipeg by the end of the week. The logical route would take him back west on the Trans-Canada, and if he wanted to investigate the abandoned town again, he could easily take the same grid road detour he'd used yesterday. Part of him wanted to do exactly that, wanted to drive back there in daylight and photograph everything, to prove to himself that the place was real and collect evidence that might explain the strangeness he'd experienced. But another part of him, the part that had seen the figure in the church doorway and felt the wrongness of those overlapping footprints, wanted nothing more than to stay on the main highway and never think about that town again. Cormac opened his laptop and pulled up satellite imagery of the area, zooming in on the grid roads south of Assiniboia. The satellite view showed exactly what he'd expect: a network of dirt roads cutting through agricultural land in perfect north-south, east-west grids. He could see abandoned farmsteads here and there, their buildings reduced to gray rectangles in the overhead view, and several towns that looked deceased from orbit. But when he tried to pinpoint the exact location where he'd turned off the grid road, where that town with the single lit house should have been, the imagery became strangely degraded. The resolution dropped dramatically, becoming pixelated and blurred, as if the satellite had malfunctioned while passing over that particular section of prairie. Cormac tried zooming in and out, refreshing the map data, even switching to different satellite providers, but the blur remained constant. It was a roughly circular area, maybe 2 kilometers in diameter, and within that circle he could make out the vague shape of what might be buildings, but no clear details. Just gray smudges that could have been anything. He sat back in his driver's seat and rubbed his eyes, trying to think through the situation logically. There were several possible explanations for what he'd experienced. The most mundane was that he'd simply lost track of time due to fatigue and stress, that the woman in the lit house had been real but unremarkable, and that his phone's GPS had glitched in a way that coincidentally erased his location data. The satellite imagery blur could be explained by cloud cover at the time the images were captured, or by deliberate degradation if the area fell under some kind of security restriction, though what would require security restrictions on empty prairie, Cormac couldn't imagine. But taken together, all these mundane explanations required an unlikely coincidence of separate technical failures and human errors. The alternative explanation was that something genuinely strange existed in that town, something that affected electronic devices and created gaps in recorded data. Something that could exist in a state between abandoned and occupied, dead and alive, present and absent. That explanation felt insane, like the plot of a horror movie rather than something that could happen to an experienced trucker on a routine delivery run. And yet Cormac couldn't dismiss it entirely, because he'd been there, had felt the wrongness with his own senses rather than just through the mediation of technology. His phone rang, breaking his spiral of thoughts, and Cormac saw his dispatcher's number on the screen. He answered on the second ring, trying to sound more alert than he felt. "Vale here." His dispatcher's voice came through with its usual brisk efficiency. "Cormac, just confirming you're clear for the swift current pickup. They're expecting you tomorrow morning between 8 and 10. Load's already staged. Should be a quick turnaround." Cormac hesitated, then asked, "What's the fastest route from Regina to Swift Current? I had some delays yesterday, and I want to make sure I build in enough buffer time." His dispatcher clicked something on his end, probably pulling up routing software. "Straight shot west on the Trans-Canada, about 240 kilometers. Road conditions are good, no construction delays reported. You should make it in under 3 hours easy." Another pause, then his dispatcher's voice took on a slightly different tone, more personal than professional. "Everything okay out there? Your GPS tracker showed some weird behavior yesterday afternoon, like you were off route for a while, but the signal was intermittent." Cormac chose his words carefully. "Yeah, I took a detour to find fuel. Cell coverage was spotty, so the tracker probably lost me for a bit. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. His dispatcher seemed satisfied with the explanation. "No problem, just wanted to make sure you weren't having equipment issues. See you on the tracking board tomorrow." After the call ended, Cormac sat with his phone in his hand, staring at the blank screen and thinking about what his dispatcher had said. The GPS tracker had shown intermittent signal, which meant it hadn't gone completely dead. It had been cutting in and out, catching fragments of his location but not enough to build a continuous route. That was different from his phone's behavior, which had simply created a void in his location history. Two different systems, two different types of failure, both occurring at the same time and place. The coincidence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He decided to search online for information about the abandoned towns in that area, to see if anyone else had reported strange experiences or unexplained phenomena. The search results were frustratingly vague. There were historical societies that documented Saskatchewan's ghost towns, complete with photos and stories about why each community had died, but nothing about ongoing strangeness. A few urban exploration blogs featured photos of abandoned grain elevators and collapsed buildings, but the bloggers treated them as purely historical subjects rather than places where anything unusual still occurred. Cormac did find one discussion thread on a trucker forum where someone had mentioned weird vibes on certain grid roads, but the responses had been mostly jokes and skepticism. One comment stood out, though, posted by a user with the handle Prairie Holler 87. "I've driven past some of those old towns late at night, and I swear sometimes you can see lights where there shouldn't be any. Not like car lights or stars, but window lights, like someone's home. But if you stop and check it out, everything's dark and empty. I think it's some kind of optical illusion, maybe reflections from distant farmsteads, but it's definitely eerie." The post was 3 years old, and when Cormac tried to click on the user's profile to see if they'd written anything else about it, he found the account had been deleted. Cormac spent the rest of the day trying to distract himself with mundane tasks, eating a proper meal at the truck stop restaurant, doing laundry at the coin-op machines, catching up on paperwork and maintenance logs, but his mind kept returning to the abandoned town and the questions that surrounded it. By evening, he'd made his decision. Tomorrow, after picking up his load in Swift Current, he would take the same grid road south and find that town again. This time, he'd be prepared. He'd bring extra flashlights, a proper camera instead of just his phone, maybe even a handheld GPS unit that wouldn't rely on cell towers. He'd document everything methodically, gather evidence that could withstand scrutiny, and then he'd decide what to do with that evidence. Maybe he'd post it online. Maybe he'd send it to local authorities, or maybe he'd just keep it as proof for himself that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. The important thing was to go back while his memory was still fresh, before time and doubt could erode the details into something unreliable. That night, Cormac slept poorly in his truck's sleeper berth, waking several times from dreams he couldn't quite remember, but which left him with a lingering sense of unease. Each time he woke, he'd check his phone to see what time it was, and each time he was surprised to find that only 20 or 30 minutes had passed when it felt like hours. The night stretched on interminably, and when his alarm finally went off at 6 a.m., Cormac felt more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. He forced himself through his morning routine: shower at the truck stop, strong coffee, pre-trip inspection of his rig, and by 7:30 he was on the Trans-Canada heading west toward Swift Current. The morning was clear and cold, frost covering every surface and turning the prairie into a landscape of white and gold. Traffic was light, mostly other commercial vehicles making their morning runs, and Cormac settled into the familiar rhythm of highway driving. The miles passed quickly, and he tried not to think about what he might find when he took that grid road detour later today. The pickup in swift current went smoothly. Cormac backed his empty flatbed into the loading dock at a farm equipment manufacturer, and within 90 minutes his trailer was loaded with new combine parts heading to Winnipeg. The load was heavy but well secured, and Cormac completed his securing inspection with extra care, checking every chain and strap twice. By 11 a.m. he was fueled up and ready to roll, sitting in his cab with the engine idling while he entered the destination into his GPS. The route it suggested was straightforward, east on the Trans-Canada all the way to Winnipeg, about 600 kilometers of easy highway driving. But Cormac dismissed that route and manually entered coordinates for a point south of Assiniboia, the approximate location where he thought the abandoned town should be. The GPS calculated a new route that would add about 50 kilometers to his journey, and flashed a warning. Route includes unpaved roads. Proceed with caution. Cormac accepted the route and pulled out of the parking lot, heading east on the Trans-Canada until he reached the turnoff that would take him south into the prairie. The grid road looked different in daylight than it had at dusk 2 days ago. What had seemed mysterious and slightly ominous, in the failing light now appeared mundane. Just a dirt road cutting through harvested fields, graded flat and wide enough for farm equipment. Cormac's truck handled it easily, the heavy load in his trailer actually helping with traction on the loose surface. He drove south for 30 kilometers, watching his odometer and comparing his position to his mental map of where the town should be. His phone still showed signal, 2 bars that wavered occasionally but never dropped to 0, and his GPS tracker was functioning normally according to the dashboard display. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, and Cormac began to wonder if he'd somehow taken the wrong road, if the town existed on a different grid road than he remembered. But then, right where it should have been, according to his calculations, he saw the grain elevator rising against the sky. His heart rate kicked up immediately, adrenaline flooding his system in a way that felt disproportionate to the simple sight of an old building. But Cormac knew why his body was reacting this way. Some animal part of his brain recognized danger even when his conscious mind was still trying to rationalize everything. He slowed his truck as he approached the town, and in daylight he could see details that had been obscured by darkness before. The grain elevator was even more deteriorated than he'd realized, its wooden walls warped and splitting. Several windows on the upper level shattered completely. The paint that had once identified the grain company was almost entirely gone, leaving just ghost letters that spelled out something like Nighty Co-op. The main street of the town stretched ahead, and Cormac could now count the buildings, maybe 20 structures in total, all in various states of collapse. What had looked like a church with a listing steeple was actually a community hall, and what he'd thought was a general store might have been a hotel at one time, judging by the faded "Rooms" sign barely visible on its false front. And there, 3 buildings down on the right side of the street, was the house with the white siding. In daylight it looked less maintained than it had at night. The paint was flaking, the porch sagged slightly, the curtains in the windows were yellowed with age, but there was still smoke rising from the chimney, a thin gray column that dissipated quickly in the wind. Someone was still there, or at least had been there recently enough to keep a fire going. Cormac pulled his truck to a stop in the middle of the street and killed the engine. The silence that followed was profound, but different from nighttime silence. Now he could hear wind moving through broken buildings, the creak of loose wood, the rattle of metal siding. Normal sounds of decay. Nothing supernatural about them. He grabbed his phone and took several photos through the windshield, documenting the grain elevator, the main street, the house with smoke rising from its chimney. The photos looked exactly like what they were. Images of an abandoned prairie town slowly returning to the earth. Nothing sinister. Nothing impossible. Cormac opened his door and climbed down from the cab, his boots raising small puffs of dust as he walked toward the house. He had his phone in one hand, camera app open and ready, and a flashlight in the other hand even though the sun was bright overhead. As he approached the porch, Cormac noticed that the footprints he'd seen 2 nights ago were still visible in the dust, though new prints had been added to the pattern. Fresh tracks, made within the last day or so, crisscrossing the porch in that same chaotic pattern that suggested many visitors. Before Cormac could knock, the door opened and the woman appeared. In daylight, she looked older than he'd initially estimated, well into her 70s at least, with deeply lined skin and hands that trembled slightly with what might have been age or cold. She was wearing different clothes than before, a heavy wool sweater and practical canvas pants, but they still had that oddly old-fashioned quality, like something from a previous era. Her expression when she saw Cormac was unreadable, somewhere between resignation and recognition, as if she'd been expecting him to return. "You came back," she said, her voice flat and unsurprised. Most people don't. Cormac tried to keep his voice steady and non-threatening. "I wanted to thank you again for helping me with fuel, and I was hoping to ask you some questions about this town, if you have time." The woman studied him for a long moment, and Cormac had the uncomfortable feeling she was assessing something about him that went beyond just his appearance or intentions. Finally, she stepped back from the doorway, a gesture that might have been invitation. "You'd better come in then. Cold out here." Cormac hesitated. Every instinct told him that entering that house was a bad idea, that whatever strangeness infected this town would be more concentrated inside the one occupied building than anywhere else. But he'd come here for answers, and he wasn't going to get them by standing on the porch. He climbed the steps carefully and crossed the threshold, entering a living room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and something else underneath. Something organic and faintly unpleasant. The interior was furnished simply, with a couch and chairs that looked like they'd been nice once but were now worn down to their frames in places. A wood stove in the corner provided heat, its metal sides radiating warmth that felt good after the cold outside. But what struck Cormac most was the sheer volume of items covering every surface. Stacks of old newspapers and magazines, boxes piled on boxes, mason jars filled with what might have been preserves or pickled vegetables, clothes draped over chairs, kitchen implements hanging from hooks on the walls. It was the accumulation of decades, maybe generations, and it gave the room a claustrophobic quality despite its size. The woman gestured to a chair and Cormac sat, his eyes scanning the room and cataloging details. On the wall behind the couch was a large photograph in a tarnished frame, showing a group of people standing in front of a much newer version of this house. Cormac counted maybe 30 individuals in the photo, ranging from children to elderly adults, all dressed in clothes that suggested the 1940s or early 1950s. "That's my family," the woman said, following his gaze. "Taken in 1947, the year the house was finished. My grandfather built it with lumber from the grain elevator when they were expanding. Everyone in that photo lived in this town at one time." She moved to the wood stove and picked up a kettle. "Tea?" Cormac nodded, not because he wanted tea, but because it seemed important to accept her hospitality. While she prepared cups, he studied the photograph more closely. The people in it looked happy, or at least content, standing in front of a house that represented stability and permanence in a landscape that offered neither. But there was something about their faces that bothered Cormac, something he couldn't quite identify. Their expressions seemed slightly off, as if they were all smiling at something behind the camera rather than at the camera itself. "What happened to the town?" Cormac asked as the woman handed him a cup of tea. "Why did everyone leave?" She sat down in the chair opposite him, her own cup cradled in both hands. "The railroad stopped coming through in 1974. That was the beginning of the end. The grain elevator closed, the co-op shut down. The school couldn't keep enough students to stay open. People started moving to bigger towns where there was work. By 1980, there were maybe 10 families left. By 90, just 3. By 2000, just me. She sipped her tea, staring into the cup as if reading something in the leaves at the bottom. My husband died in 1998. Cancer. After that, I was alone. But this is my home. And I stayed. Cormac felt a pang of sympathy mixed with confusion. But how do you manage out here by yourself? Groceries, medical care, utilities. The woman waved a hand dismissively. I manage, have a truck, drive to Assiniboia when I need supplies. Solar panels on the roof for electricity. Well, for water. I don't need much. It was a plausible explanation, but something about it didn't quite fit. Cormac hadn't seen a truck parked at the house last night, though he supposed it could have been in a garage or shed he hadn't noticed. Can I ask your name? Cormac said, pulling out his phone. I'd like to document this if that's okay. Your story about staying in a town after everyone else left, it's remarkable. The woman's expression tightened slightly, and she set her cup down with a sound that was louder than necessary. Hester Longridge. Been a Longridge since I married in 1952, was a Cuthbert before that, and I'm not sure I want to be documented, young man. I value my privacy. Cormac lowered his phone. I understand. I'm sorry. I don't have to take pictures or record anything if you're not comfortable, but I am curious about something. 2 nights ago when I was here, I saw footprints on your porch. A lot of them, more than just yours. Do you get visitors? Hester's face went carefully blank and she was silent for several seconds before responding. Neighbors stop by sometimes, other people who stayed in the area. It was the first thing she'd said that Cormac knew with certainty was a lie. There were no neighbors, no other occupied houses for kilometers in any direction. He'd seen that from the road, had confirmed it with satellite imagery. He decided to push a little harder. Mrs. Longridge, I need to be honest with you. Something strange happened to me when I was here before. I lost time, about an hour that I can't account for. My phone's location history has a gap where this town should be recorded, and the fuel I got from the co-op pump, it seemed to be too fresh for a tank that's been sealed for decades. Hester stood up abruptly, her cup clattering to the floor and spilling tea across the worn carpet. I think you should leave now. Her voice had changed, become harder and colder, and Cormac could see tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. You got your fuel, you went on your way, that's the end of it. You shouldn't have come back. Cormac rose slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. I don't mean any disrespect. I'm just trying to understand what's happening here. Hester moved toward the door, clearly expecting him to follow. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some places should be left alone. You're not from here. You don't know how things work out on the prairie. Old places have old rules, and breaking those rules brings nothing but trouble. Before Cormac could respond, there was a knock at the door. Not a normal knock. It was rhythmic and precise. 3 sharp raps, followed by 2 softer ones, followed by 3 sharp ones again. Hester froze, her face draining of color so quickly that Cormac thought she might faint. The knock came again, the exact same pattern, and this time Cormac heard voices outside. Multiple voices speaking in unison, saying something he couldn't quite make out. Hester grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his jacket. "Don't open that door," she hissed. "Don't look at them, don't speak to them, don't acknowledge them in any way." The fear in her voice was genuine and absolute, and it sent Cormac's own fear spiking upward. "Who is it?" he whispered. "What's out there?" Hester pulled him away from the door, backing deeper into the living room. The others. The ones who didn't leave when they should have, They're still here, in a manner of speaking. They come around sometimes, especially when there are visitors. They don't like visitors." The voices outside grew louder, and now Cormac could make out words. "Join us inside, Mrs. Longridge. We know you have company. We'd like to meet him properly." The tone was pleasant, almost cheerful, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it. The voices were too similar, like a chorus singing in perfect unison, and the words had a stilted quality, as if being read from a script. Cormac moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to see the porch, and what he saw made his breath catch. There were people out there, at least a dozen of them, standing on the porch and in the yard beyond. But they weren't moving naturally. They stood too still, their posture too rigid, their faces all turned toward the door with identical expressions of anticipation. And their clothes were wrong, decades out of date, the same styles Cormac had seen in the 1947 photograph on the wall. As he watched, one of them turned to look directly at the window where he stood, and Cormac saw that their eyes were clouded over with a milky white film, like cataracts but covering the entire surface. The figure smiled, showing too many teeth, and raised one hand in a slow wave. Cormac dropped the curtain and stepped back, his heart hammering. "What are they?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Hester had moved to the opposite side of the room, as far from the door and windows as possible. "They're what's left," she said quietly. "The people who loved this town too much to leave even after it died. They're bound to it somehow. Can't move on, can't rest. During the day they mostly stay out of sight, but at night, or when there are visitors, they come out. They want company. They want to add to their number." The knocking came again, more insistent now, and Cormac heard the doorknob rattle as someone tested it. "Mrs. Longridge, don't be rude. You've always been such a good neighbor, such a pillar of the community. Surely you can spare a few minutes to chat with old friends." Hester's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not like them. I'm still alive, still real, but I can't leave either. Been here too long, become too much a part of this place. I'm trapped between what they are and what you are, and every day it gets harder to remember which side I'm supposed to be on." Cormac pulled out his phone, intending to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. 0 bars, emergency calls only. He tried anyway, dialing 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just a spinning icon and then an error message. "There's no signal here," Hester said, watching him fumble with his phone. "Never has been, not really. Sometimes it looks like there is, enough to fool people into thinking they're still connected to the outside world. But this place doesn't let signals in or out. Not anymore." The door handle rattled more violently, and Cormac heard wood beginning to splinter. Whatever was outside was getting impatient, moving beyond polite knocking to actual, forced entry. "Is there a back door?" Cormac asked urgently. "Another way out?" Hester pointed to a doorway that led deeper into the house. "Kitchen. Back door leads to the yard. But they'll be waiting there too. They always cover all the exits." Cormac moved toward the kitchen anyway, needing to see for himself, and found that Hester was right. Through the kitchen window he could see more figures in the backyard, standing in a loose semicircle facing the house. They were all dressed in outdated clothes, all standing with that same unnatural stillness, all watching the house with those clouded eyes. "How do I get out of here?" Cormac asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "There has to be a way. I got out before. I can do it again." Hester moved to stand beside him, and for the first time he saw something like pity in her expression. "You got out before because they let you, because you were just passing through, just taking fuel and leaving. But you came back asking questions, trying to document things. That's different. That makes you interesting to them. That makes you a potential recruit." She pointed toward the front of the house where the sounds of forced entry were getting louder. "The only way out is through them. You'll have to walk past them, get to your truck, and drive away without stopping. Don't look at them directly. Don't respond if they speak to you. And whatever you do, don't touch them. If you can make it to the edge of town without acknowledging them, they'll lose their hold on you." It sounded like the rules from a fairy tale, arbitrary and impossible to follow, but Cormac didn't have better options. "What about you?" he asked. "Come with me. Get out of this place while you still can." Hester shook her head sadly. "Too late for me. Been here too long. Let too much of this place into my bones. If I tried to leave now, I'd probably just become one of them fully. Lose the last little bit of myself that's still human. At least here, like this, I can remember who I was. I can maintain some small piece of my own identity." She moved to a drawer and pulled out an old revolver, checking to make sure it was loaded. "I'm not planning to use this on them. Bullets don't do much to stop what they are. But it helps me feel like I still have some control, like I'm still a person with choices rather than just part of the landscape." The sound of splintering wood came from the front room, and Cormac knew he was out of time. He moved quickly back through the living room toward the front door and saw that it was bowing inward, the frame cracking under sustained pressure. The voices outside had risen in volume and excitement, a chorus of overlapping phrases that created a sound like wind through a tunnel. Cormac grabbed the door handle, took a deep breath, and pulled it open before his courage could fail. The figures on the porch fell silent immediately, their attention snapping to him with predatory intensity. Up close, Cormac could see more details. Their skin had a waxy quality, like old paper, and their clothes were immaculate despite being decades out of style. They all wore slight smiles, exposing teeth that were too white and too uniform, and those clouded eyes tracked his movement with an awareness that was definitely not human. "Hello," said the figure closest to him, a man wearing a 1950s-style suit with a narrow tie. "We've been hoping you'd join us. Mrs. Longridge has been monopolizing your time, and that's hardly neighborly. We have so much to show you about our wonderful town." The others nodded in unison, still smiling, still standing in their unnatural stillness. Cormac remembered Hester's instructions. Don't acknowledge them. Don't make eye contact. Don't respond. He stepped forward onto the porch, moving sideways to slip past the closest figures, and they tracked his movement with their heads, but didn't reach for him. Not yet. The walk from the porch to his truck felt like the longest journey of Cormac's life. The figures formed a corridor on either side of him close enough that he could feel the cold radiating from their bodies, and they spoke to him as he passed. "Won't you stay for dinner? Mrs. Longridge is making her famous pot roast. You really should try it. We have such a nice community here, everyone knows everyone. You'd fit right in. The grain elevator is still operational, you know. We could use a good driver to help with the harvest. The harvest never ends here." Their voices washed over him like cold water, tempting and terrible in equal measure, and Cormac had to clench his jaw to keep from responding. His truck was 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. The figures weren't blocking his path directly, but they were closing in from the sides, narrowing the corridor, and Cormac could see more of them emerging from the abandoned buildings, scores of people who shouldn't exist, all converging on the street where his truck was parked. He reached for his door handle and heard a voice directly beside his ear, so close that cold breath touched his skin. "You can't leave. The town needs you. We need you. Stay. Stay. Stay." The word repeated in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and Cormac felt a pull, an almost physical sensation like hooks catching in his skin and pulling him back toward the center of town. His hand froze on the door handle, and for a terrible moment he couldn't remember why he wanted to leave. Couldn't remember why staying in this pleasant prairie town with these friendly neighbors wasn't exactly what he wanted. Then he caught sight of his reflection in the truck's window, his own face, looking scared and alive and real, and the spell broke. He yanked the door open, hauled himself up into the cab and slammed the door shut behind him. The figures pressed against the truck immediately, their hands leaving prints on the windows, their faces pressed close to the glass. But they didn't try to open the doors, didn't attempt to break the windows. They just watched him with those clouded eyes, still smiling, still waiting. Cormac started his engine with shaking hands and put the truck in gear. The figures didn't move away from the vehicle, and for a moment he thought he'd have to actually drive through them. But as his truck began to roll forward, they melted back like smoke, disappearing into the spaces between buildings or simply fading from view. Within seconds, the street was empty again, as if they'd never been there at all. Cormac drove slowly through the town, fighting the urge to floor the accelerator and race away. Something told him that showing fear would be a mistake, that he needed to maintain control and dignity even in retreat. As he passed the house with the white siding, he saw Hester standing in the doorway, watching him leave. She raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning, and then she stepped back inside and closed the door. Cormac had the sudden conviction that he'd never see her again, that she'd finally crossed whatever threshold separated her from the other residents of this dead town, and that the next time someone drove through here looking for fuel, they'd find nothing but empty buildings and silence. The edge of town was marked by a faded sign he hadn't noticed on his way in, so weathered that he couldn't read what it said. But as his truck passed that sign, Cormac felt something release, a pressure he hadn't fully registered until it was gone, like surfacing from deep water. His phone suddenly chimed with a flood of notifications, messages and alerts all arriving at once as signal returned. His GPS tracker blinked back to life, showing his position on the grid road south of Assiniboia. And his dashboard clock jumped forward by 47 minutes, time that had passed in the outside world while he'd been inside that house talking to Hester Longridge. Cormac didn't stop driving until he was back on the Trans-Canada, surrounded by normal traffic and normal landscape and the blessed mundanity of commercial highway travel. He pulled into the first truck stop he saw and sat in his cab with the engine running, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were still shaking, his heart still racing, and when he looked in his mirror he saw that his face was pale and drawn with the kind of exhaustion that came from sustained terror rather than physical exertion. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera roll, intending to review the photos he'd taken of the town. But the folder was empty. The images he'd captured were gone, replaced by corrupted file icons that wouldn't open. He tried his video app, thinking maybe he'd accidentally recorded video instead of stills, but that was empty too. Every piece of digital evidence he'd intended to collect had been erased or corrupted, leaving him with nothing but his own memory to prove that the experience had been real. Cormac sat in the parking lot for over an hour, watching normal people come and go from the truck stop, pumping gas and buying coffee and chatting on their phones like the world made sense. Eventually, he forced himself to get moving, to continue his delivery run to Winnipeg and act like nothing had happened. But he knew he'd been changed by the experience, knew that some part of him would always be back in that abandoned town, with those smiling figures and Hester Longridge's warning about old places and old rules. He drove east on the Trans-Canada, watching the prairie unfold around him, and couldn't help but wonder how many other dead towns were out there, populated by people who'd loved their homes too much to leave even after death. How many other travelers had taken wrong turns and found themselves trapped in places that existed outside normal time and space, places that fed on the living to sustain themselves. The delivery to Winnipeg was completed without incident 3 days later, and Cormac filed his logbook and paperwork with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd always maintained. But there was a gap in his records that couldn't be explained away. Those missing 47 minutes from when his GPS tracker had gone offline until it had come back. His company's safety department flagged it for review, and Cormac was called into a meeting to explain the discrepancy. He told them a simplified version of the truth, that he'd stopped in an abandoned town to check his load securement and had lost track of time. The explanation was accepted, but noted in his file as a concerning lapse, and Cormac knew that too many such incidents would eventually cost him his job. After that, he avoided grid roads entirely, sticking to major highways and authorized routes even when they added time and distance to his deliveries. He never mentioned what had happened to other drivers, never posted about it online, never tried to find that town again. The memory stayed with him, though, sharp and clear, and sometimes at night he'd wake from dreams of figures standing in the darkness outside his truck, smiling and waiting for him to acknowledge them. 6 months after his experience, Cormac was hauling a load through Saskatchewan on the Trans-Canada when he passed a highway sign he'd seen hundreds of times before. Assiniboia 45 km. On impulse, he pulled over at the next rest area and opened his laptop to check satellite imagery of the area south of that town, the same area he'd searched before. The blur was gone. The satellite view now showed clear, high-resolution images of the prairie, and Cormac could see the grid roads and abandoned farmsteads in perfect detail. He zoomed in on the location where the town should have been, the place where he'd gotten fuel and met Hester Longridge, and encountered the figures that shouldn't exist. What he saw made his blood run cold. There was nothing there. No grain elevator, no buildings, no main street, just empty prairie, stubble fields, and a slight depression in the ground that might have been where a town once stood before it was completely erased by time and weather. According to the satellite timestamp, the image had been captured 2 weeks ago, meaning this wasn't old data. This was current, accurate photography of a landscape that contained nothing but grass and sky. Cormac zoomed in as far as the software would allow, searching for any sign that structures had ever existed in that location. He found a few geometric patterns in the earth that might have been building foundations, and what looked like a dirt track where the main street would have been. But there were no standing buildings, no grain elevator, no house with white siding. It was as if the town he'd visited had simply ceased to exist, or had never existed at all, outside of some pocket reality that his truck had accidentally driven into. He closed his laptop and sat in the rest area parking lot, watching transport trucks roll past on the Trans-Canada, and tried to reconcile what he knew had happened with what the satellite imagery was telling him. Both couldn't be true simultaneously. Either the town existed or it didn't. Either he'd been there or he hadn't. But the missing time was real. The corrupted photos were real. The gaps in his GPS tracking were real. Something had happened to him on those grid roads south of Assiniboia. Something that his equipment and his company's systems had recorded, even if they hadn't understood what they were recording. Cormac never took another load that would route him through that part of Saskatchewan. He requested transfers to different regions, accepted longer hauls that kept him in other provinces, and eventually moved primarily to eastern routes where the prairie was just a memory behind him. But he knew other drivers still ran those roads, still took shortcuts on grid roads to save time or find fuel, and he wondered how many of them had encountered places like that town. How many had driven through gaps in reality without even realizing it, their GPS systems glitching briefly before resuming normal function, their memories already beginning to fade and rationalize the strangeness into something explainable. And he wondered about Hester Longridge, whether she was still in that house with the white siding, still maintaining the last fragments of her humanity while surrounded by neighbors who'd become something else. or whether she'd finally given in, finally let the town claim her completely, and now stood with the others waiting for the next lost driver to stumble into their trap. Years later, Cormac would occasionally search online for mentions of abandoned towns in Saskatchewan, looking for any stories that matched his experience. He never found anything concrete, just the usual ghost town photography blogs and historical society documentation. But once he came across a discussion thread on a paranormal forum where someone had posted a question: "Has anyone else experienced time loss while driving through rural Saskatchewan?" The responses were mostly jokes and skepticism, but buried in the thread was a comment from someone with the username GrainHauler93 that made Cormac's hands go cold. Happened to me about 10 years ago. Stopped for fuel in a town that shouldn't have been there. Got help from an old woman who seemed normal at first. When I tried to leave, there were people outside who didn't look right, didn't move right. I made it out, but lost about an hour somewhere in the process. Never went back, never told anyone because I knew they wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I know that place is still out there, waiting for someone else to take a wrong turn. Cormac wanted to reach out to that person, to compare notes and confirm that they'd experienced the same thing. But when he clicked on their username, he found the account had been deleted. Just like Prairie Hauler 87, and who knew how many others who'd tried to share their experiences only to find that no one believed them, or that their stories disappeared into the digital void. It was as if the town had a way of protecting itself, of ensuring that warnings never reached the people who might need them most. Cormac sat at his computer in his apartment, thousands of kilometers from the Saskatchewan prairie, and felt the weight of knowledge that couldn't be shared, truth that couldn't be proven, and danger that couldn't be avoided because the people who needed avoiding it would never know it was there until it was too late. He thought about writing his own warning, posting his story online with all the details he could remember, but he knew how it would be received, with skepticism and jokes and rational explanations that would dismiss everything he'd experienced as hallucination or fabrication. So instead, Cormac kept his silence and carried his knowledge alone. He continued driving trucks across Canada, sticking to major routes and avoiding shortcuts that might lead to places that existed in the margins of reality. He kept his logbooks meticulously accurate, his equipment properly maintained, his loads secured according to regulations. And he tried not to think about Hester Longridge standing in her doorway, waving goodbye to a man who'd just barely escaped the same fate she'd accepted for herself. Sometimes, late at night when he was pulled over at a rest stop trying to sleep, Cormac would turn on his CB radio and scan through channels, listening to the chatter of other drivers out there in the darkness. Mostly, it was mundane stuff. Weather reports, traffic conditions, complaints about dispatchers and delays. But occasionally, he'd hear something strange, a voice that didn't quite belong asking questions about abandoned towns, or reporting lost time, or describing encounters with people who didn't seem fully human. When that happened, Cormac would grab his handset and try to respond, try to offer whatever warning or advice he could. But his transmissions never seemed to reach the drivers who needed them most. Just static and silence and the frustrating knowledge that history was repeating itself somewhere out there on a dark grid road. The prairie kept its secrets, and the dead towns kept their residents, and drivers kept taking wrong turns that led them to places they couldn't explain afterward. And Cormac kept driving, kept watching his mirrors for signs of something following, kept checking his GPS for gaps that might indicate he'd driven through another pocket of wrongness. He'd gotten out once, but he knew with absolute certainty that he'd been lucky rather than skilled, and that luck had limits that skill didn't. The town, whatever it had been, whatever it still was, remained out there south of Assiniboia, waiting in patient hunger for the next traveler who needed fuel or shelter, or just a place to rest for a few minutes. And when that traveler arrived, they'd find a house with a light on, an old woman who seemed helpful, and neighbors who wanted nothing more than to welcome them into a community that never truly died because it couldn't bear to let go. Cormac had seen that future reflected in those clouded eyes and those two white smiles, and he knew it was a fate he'd escaped by the narrowest of margins. Some roads led nowhere good, and some towns should stay abandoned, and some knowledge was better left unconfirmed. That was the lesson the prairie had taught him, written in missing time and corrupted photos, and the memory of figures that shouldn't exist still standing in the street watching his truck drive away into a world that wouldn't believe what he'd seen there.